Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast, and this is a continuation of an episode that I released mid last year in 2025 called 2025 Roundup Part 1. So if you haven't heard that, there's a lot more context about what exactly this series of episodes is meant to be. But in short, instead of putting my time and energy into creating and having to edit a bunch of shorts and reels throughout the year to give my quick reactions to movies and TV that I have a reaction to, and instead reserve that time and energy for longer, more thought out videos that I like to make on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/breathingunderwater. I'm instead going to record my thoughts and reactions as they come up and then compile them together on an episode or two like this one, because I had so many thoughts and reactions to so many things throughout 2025 that one episode would have just been way too long. So here we are. It's currently mid-July, and though this wasn't something that was released in 2025, I just happened to catch up with it and binge it in 2025, and that is The Good Place, a show that my wife and daughter really love and have shared a lot of references to over the past few years. So I finally said, okay, I need to be included in this. Let's watch this. And I really had no idea what it was about, other than obviously I knew that The Good Place was a stand-in for heaven, The Bad Place was hell. But other than that vague idea, I really didn't know what to expect. And I could spend all day talking about the thematic content and the philosophical, intellectual stuff, because there is just so much to unpack there, which I was not expecting from a half-hour sitcom format comedy show. And it may not be surprising with the amount that I like to ramble on here, but taking philosophy back in actually my senior year of high school, even though it was a college course, because I did one of those things where I left halfway through the day from high school and then I went and took some college courses at the local community college. I took like Psych 101 and Philosophy 101 just to get some general ed stuff out of the way before I actually graduated and went to college. Still ended up taking 5 years to get my bachelor's, but that's a whole story for a whole nother time. But philosophy especially really stood out to me as one of the most fun college classes that I ever took, because you got to sit around and debate and BS big ideas and ways of thinking and living, and there was never any conclusion. Nobody was right, nobody was wrong, or everybody was right and everybody was wrong. Just depends on how good of an argument you could make. And though I was never the best debater or arguer with these kind of high-minded academic ideas, I really love thinking about consciousness and existence and morality and ethics and everything. So it was really fun to revisit a lot of those ideas and a lot of the names that came up when I took philosophy. But just like in that class where I learned that we could debate endlessly and never get anywhere, I don't really feel like it's going to be super productive if I start to go into all that. Really what I want to do is just give my general reactions to the show overall. And I got to say, I think it was one of the most brilliant and subversive shows and satires that I've ever seen, but especially in the format and being a network show, to be simultaneously like one big pun and fart joke to also being very brainy and cerebral and intellectual, and not just with what the characters were talking about, but how the characters interacted and developed and progressed and how that affected the plot. I just cannot think of another example, at least that I've seen or heard about, of a half-hour sitcom format show that is completely serialized and every episode and every season builds off the last one. They really don't have a status quo like most sitcoms do, where you have your characters start an episode or a season where you're used to them being more or less, with maybe some minor changes here and there of like who's dating who or who's working somewhere or whatever. But generally people are kind of like just doing their thing, and then something comes up in that particular episode that creates zany antics and conflict that's usually resolved by the end of that episode, unless it's some special two-parter or something. And then things generally return back to the status quo. And obviously the reason for that is so that audiences can kind of drop in at any point. They don't have to start at the beginning and work through it tediously, especially coming from the network TV era where there was a lot of casual viewership where people would just check in once in a while on what Jim and Pam were doing on The Office, or what JD and Elliot were doing on Scrubs or Friends or How I Met Your Mother or whatever. but you didn't have to religiously watch every single episode to know what was going on generally, and you could get caught up pretty quickly. But things change so profoundly, so often in The Good Place. It really took me by surprise, and pleasantly so, because even though I love a good sitcom like Parks and Rec and Scrubs, sometimes the long game of waiting for character development and arcs and stuff can get tedious, for me at least, as a viewer. And that's why it also helped that it was only like a half-season show, like 12 or 13 episodes a season. And with that, and how well the characters were fleshed out, and how specific and convoluted the plot was from the very beginning and just became more and more so, it really spoke to me that the writers of the show had a very specific intention from the get-go, and they knew where they were going. Maybe they didn't know exactly how many seasons they were going to have, but it really seemed like they did, because the story was very tight. There was almost no fluff or filler or redundancy. Things just kept moving forward. And that, frankly, just astonished me. And maybe it was just my expectations were subverted. But it was also hilarious. I loved how the humor was often very, like, play on wordy, lots of puns, lots of lowbrow stuff, slapstick, juvenile humor. But then it would offset that with, again, like the very high-minded, brainy philosophy, ethics, and morality stuff. Not to mention all of the metaphysical afterlife and answers to the universe kind of ideas, and how so much of it was played off as jokes, like the way time worked, Jeremy Bearimy. Even though, especially after a while, once you really got to know the characters, like you could predict generally a retort or a line of dialogue from like Jason or Tahani saying something snooty or something incredibly dumb and off topic. It was still consistently clever, and I lulled many times an episode. The only thing that didn't quite work for me, even though I don't think it was poorly written or executed or anything, but I just didn't feel the chemistry between Chidi and Eleanor like I think the show wanted me to. And part of that, I think, was related to the fact that they got rebooted so many times that I really wasn't clear on if the characters by, like, I think, what was it, season 3, were really the same characters as where we started. They were like, you know, different versions and iterations of themselves with echoes and whispers of what came before. And I guess they resolved all that in the end when they got their memories back from all the reboots. But plot-wise and narrative-wise, Chidi and Eleanor definitely worked for me. There was just something a little obtuse. I really can't put my finger on it, but I think it might have just been the chemistry of the actors. You know, it's just like that X factor that you can't explain. But it didn't, like, detract from the show or anything. I still was really invested in their relationship and what it meant for the show as a whole. It just didn't have the same visceral effect on me that, like, you know, Jim and Pam did. They were just so good together. Not just the characters, but the actors. It was so natural. But yeah, I think it was a fantastic show. I'm so glad I watched it. I'm really interested to see it again someday, now knowing what it is, and I can really, like, dig in deeper to all the philosophy and everything, because they do throw a lot at you, and a lot happens really fast. But it kept me on my toes. I didn't know where they were going with things from episode to episode and season to season. The ending was definitely bittersweet, but satisfying. I think it was as good of an ending you can give to a long-form television show that they could have done. Still mid-July, and finally season 17 of Always Sunny in Philadelphia has finally started dropping, which of course premiered with the Abbot Elementary crossover, this time the side of the gang, and what we didn't see from the Abbot Elementary version. And I honestly don't really have that much to say about it. I'm only really including this because I had talked about it on part 1 of this episode with the Abbot Elementary Always Sunny crossover from earlier in the year. And as I'm sure I said back then, Always Sunny is probably my favorite show. And I've been consistently impressed and amazed that it's been able to stay so funny, having been on the air for so long at this point. But I gotta say, this episode was, to me, not bad or unfunny by any means, but just a more kind of mediocre, middling, middle-of-the-road Always Sunny episode, as it were, because I didn't really feel like it added much to the whole thing. They actually alluded to a lot of, I think, what would have been a lot more interesting ground to cover in the Abbott Elementary side, where they talk about all the things that led to them having to do this court-ordered community service. And then we get hints of stuff that I was assuming was going to be really funny and shocking, like the reason that Dennis didn't want to be on camera. But then we found out he was just like making coffee the whole time and trying to play nice. So yeah, there were a lot of funny moments, especially because of what we saw in that original episode and how it fleshed a lot of that stuff out. And it was definitely funny and shocking to hear the Abbott Elementary PG-13 or TV-14 level of material that they usually have to work with, getting to really let loose and say a lot of crass and super vulgar stuff that you would never be able to do on network television. But I don't know, I didn't feel like it took things very far. It didn't go to any extremes, really. It was very meta, to the point that I didn't think it was that profound or hilarious for somebody else to notice that the gang just sits around and argues needlessly about the most like petty, inane things, because we already know that. And for somebody else to find that out didn't really come as a big revelation. So it was fine. But I honestly think that the Abbott Elementary side was a lot more novel and funny, which is ironic because Always Sunny is the boundary pushing show and Abbott is much more of a, from what I've seen at least, a by the book network television mockumentary show, which is fine. But it was a subsequent episode about cake that I thought was one of the best episodes ever of that show, because it took things so far and came back around to one simple punchline and premise that was so hilarious and shocking. That's what Always Sunny, I think, is best at. Like they always said from the early seasons, it's like Seinfeld to the extreme, where you take something inane, simple, everyday, ordinary, and you push it past any level of normality or acceptability or predictability. And that's what makes shows like this what they are. So it was just weird to me that the Always Sunny side of the Abbott crossover still felt pretty tame, like they were trying to appease Abbott fans. I don't know. But I was overall pretty underwhelmed after all the hype and all the stuff that they seemed to set up in the Abbott episode. But luckily, the next episode of Sunny got me super hyped for the rest of the season. So my wife and I finally sat down and watched Havoc last night. It's been on my list on Netflix since it came out. But we finally decided it was an action movie night because I generally heard good things about it when the reviews first came out, but also it had a really enticing cast. Tom Hardy, Forrest Whitaker, Timothy Olyphant. Plus it was directed by the guy that made the Raid movies, so I felt it was at least worth giving it a chance. And honestly, by the time the movie ended, I just looked at my wife and I was like, how did they get these big name actors for this script? Because it wasn't bad by any means, but it was so generic, and we really didn't get to know anything about any of the characters beyond just surface stuff or what mattered for the plot, with the exception of Tom Hardy's partner, who I actually thought was an interesting character, and she was a really good actor and performed the role really well, to the point that I was interested to know more about her, to see more with her, whereas Tom Hardy was just doing Tom Hardy. Forrest Whitaker is always great, but the writing gave him nothing. And boy, did this one stretch believability. I mean, it's no new thing for hordes of henchmen to get mowed down by bullets raining from all angles, but the problem is when that's contrasted with your main characters being totally untouchable. And yeah, like, you know, they caught a graze here and there. Somebody would land a punch every once in a while. But for the most part, until the very end, Hardy, Oliphant, they just like were bulletproof. And there was no tension around that. I did enjoy the action. I mean, it was really over the top, sometimes cartoonily so. But it was fun, hyper-violent, very fluid. It just took so long to get to it. In a 2-hour movie, the first half was all just setup, but it wasn't that interesting. So when it got to the action, I was kind of bored. And then the action was so frenetic and manic, and the shaky cam was really distracting. I didn't hate it, and I was overall entertained by it, but it was just another case of hoping for, and I know stupidly expecting, just a little bit more than a run-of-the-mill, generic, uber-violent action movie, especially because it had such a stacked cast, and obviously a big budget, and a director that's more than proven himself in this genre. So, alas, it was just another victim of streaming mediocrity And it really makes me wonder why streaming services are so hell-bent on spending so much money and getting so much talent to make these otherwise like utterly forgettable throwaway things. I mean, I guess it is kind of like theatrical Hollywood in a way where the only thing they really care about is the opening weekend numbers. It seems like all they care about is with these algorithmic minded movies and content on streaming services is that it gets some kind of initial recognition and they can advertise it as one of their top 10 for like a week or so, and then it's just utterly forgotten about. But I really don't think that would be the case if they put a little bit more effort, starting with the freaking script. It's late July, and my wife and I were in between shows, so I suggested a palate cleanser with watching a movie, and we had a whole bunch of stuff in our various streaming site queues, or lists as they call them these days, or my stuff, but I remember back when Netflix had a queue when we could use adult language, and we weren't tweeted like a bunch of little babies that didn't know how to... Okay, anyway, so we landed on a movie that definitely did not come out this year. It came out back in the 80s. One that my wife grew up on, but I had never seen, barely even heard of. I don't think I've heard it talked about. But I remember seeing the video cover in Blockbuster growing up, and I've always liked John Cusack, and she'd been saying for a while that we need to watch this, so we chose Better Off Dead. And knowing that Cusack had been a teen heartthrob back in the 80s, even though I didn't see a lot of the John Hughes stuff, etc. until I was older. Like, I never saw Pretty in Pink or 16 Candles. I don't know if he's in all of those, but I don't know. I equate him with a lot of that stuff. I saw him in more of his late 90s, early 2000s, like rom-com output, High Fidelity, Serendipity. But I always liked him. And being a purveyor of some John Hughes stuff, of course, like Home Alone and the infamous Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which I know is not groundbreaking at all to say, but as I am filled with humility to admit always on here that I am very basic. So of course I love Ferris Bueller's Day Off and how meta and self-aware and fourth wall breaky it is, how edgy it is because of all that. But since this was not John Hughes, instead by a director named Savage, which is a baller name, I went in expecting more of a standard rom-com 80s teen angst kind of fare, if not maybe a little bit more on the dramedy side, like Breakfast Club. But oh boy, I was not prepared for this movie. In the end, I really enjoyed it. But as I was watching it, I was so constantly taken aback by the insane level of farce going on. But what I really appreciated about it, and why, though I'll always have a soft spot for Ferris Bueller because I saw that when I was younger, and there's that nostalgia factor to it, which I don't have for this one, but my wife does, because she said it was one of her favorite movies growing up. But I would contend this with at the same level or better than something like Ferris Bueller, because it was so self-aware and so intentional, but it didn't feel the need to communicate directly with the audience. To me, especially now in like the Deadpool era, and we're right on the brink of like the new Naked Gun coming out, which I talked about on the last episode, part 1 of this podcast, where the trailer for that really made me realize how much funnier comedy is, for me at least, when the characters in the movie aren't in on the joke, when they're playing it straight and they're living in a world that is real and serious to them, and we're laughing at them, at how farcical it is. I don't know, that just works better for me, but it also conveys to me just a little bit more respect for the audience and our intelligence, that like we can get the joke without having it to be like winked and explained to us or pointed out to us by the filmmakers. Like, I do enjoy that brand of comedy, and I have enjoyed all the Deadpool movies for what they're worth. But in hindsight, with something like Ferris Bueller being more of an exception, because it's so integrated into the character of Ferris, and it kind of fits with his like observational teenage philosopher character that drives the plot, as opposed to like Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool, who's just like a snarky jack that doesn't have to look at the camera and say things directly to the audience. And I really don't think that those movies would be lesser if they didn't have all the fourth wall breaking, though I know that originates from the comics. I totally understand, but I also looking at this purely from the movie output and not, I don't know, bigger picture. But anyway, I just found Better Off Dead to be so clever in its execution because everything was a wink and a nod, but it was never directed at the audience. It was like we were given the autonomy to interpret the jokes the way that they worked for us, the way that we could relate to them. And it was such a relatable story because it was just about like a few weeks in the life of a teenager, and most of us have experienced that. And at first I was really not quite sure what the heck was going on until my wife pointed out to me that her interpretation is that the whole thing is in the direct point of view of a teenager. Like we're in his head and we're seeing things through his eyes. So that's why everything is like cranked up to the emotions, to the way people talk, to like his food crawling away at the dinner table, a la Calvin and Hobbes. These are all like the flights of fancy and imagination and detachment from the inane, boring reality that teenagers process the world through. So once I got that joke, I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. There was no moment in it that felt sort of wasted or sloppy. Everything was really precise and really just seemed to have intention behind every choice. Whereas there's a lot of comedies, especially 80s comedies, even John Hughes stuff, that are a little awkward, which I know they're supposed to be in context, you know, of the characters in the story, but I'm talking more about the craft. Like the actors are just a little bit uncomfortable delivering their lines sometimes. There's like dead air after lines are spoken. The editing's a little weird. The pacing is off. So in that way, a lot of those movies, even though Better Off Dead obviously didn't have a huge budget either, a lot of stuff from that era feels a little cheap, or maybe unrefined is a better word, because I don't mean on the money front or the mise en scène or anything. I'm talking about more of the flow and the, I don't know, essence, the way that it feels. And Better Off Dead really felt like a lower budget 80s teen comedy. But to me, it came across much more kind of masterful and clean and tight. It followed through with everything that it set out to do, and it did it like immaculately. I also loved the animation breaks. There was both a 2D and a stop motion kind of animated dream sequence, because I just love animation, but I also love when it's integrated into stuff like this, Monty Python, where it's not like necessary, but it just adds to the zaniness and really fulfills the wacky tone and the farce. So yeah, I'm really bummed that I missed out on this one all through my youth and young adult years, but I'm glad I finally saw it, and I'm really looking forward to watching it again. Still in late July here, and now that the buzz has reached a peak, my wife and I sat down and watched K-Pop Demon Hunters. And I saw this advertised on Netflix when it first came out a few weeks ago, but I just thought it was like a throwaway, churned out, just tossed on streaming, something to occupy the kids' time with bright lights and music and colors, a la like Disney Channel level kid cartoon kind of stuff. I had no idea that it was a Sony animation, so I just wrote it off completely, but then it just kept getting all this hype. So I was like, well, I might as well check this out, because even adults were saying like, hey, this is worth your time, especially, you know, if you like The Last Wish and Wild Robot, Spider-Verse, and stuff of that level. And yeah, I see why everybody's talking about it. It is one of the better animated movies that I've seen in a while. It was a lot of fun, moved really fast, but still did a good job establishing, developing its characters. The music was, I'm not super familiar with K-pop, other than that it exists and it's some of the top selling music in the world. But just as is in this movie, I found it to be very fun and catchy and entertaining. And the fact that they were K-pop stars really helped the immersion for me of the musical factor, because even when they would break out into song in non-concert settings or whatever, it just fit the characters and this world. And I like musicals. I have no problem with musicals in general, but sometimes it is a little disconcerting when you're watching a story and then all of a sudden they start singing, especially if it's not consistent. I said this a long time ago on this podcast that I think Frozen is a very poor musical. Well, not only because the musical numbers are mid, but because they stopped singing songs like halfway through the movie. So it was kind of like, what the heck is the point anyway? It could have just been a straight up non-musical and it wouldn't have really made a big difference other than its selling potential. But the fact that the characters being musicians and that being part of their powers and part of the whole plot MacGuffin about saving the world just really helped with the internal logic of why they would be singing so much and writing music and thinking about it. I just thought that was really clever. But I also thought it was really clever how it was such a fun blend of genre, not just stylistically, because obviously they had like chibi stuff, which I don't know very much about Korean animation. Obviously anime is like the most prominent form of Asiatic, if that's the right term for that, animation outside of Asia. So that's what I'm just more familiar with. But whether or not it was specific to Korean animated stylings or not, and they were just sort of encompassing a wider range of things, kind of like Avatar, Last Airbender would do. That was all really fun and silly and entertaining. But so was the fact that it was a musical, but it was also an action, but also a romance. And it felt kind of pretty well balanced at equal parts of all the things that it set out to do. I thought it did them all pretty well. My only, not even gripe, but just critique was that it was so fast-paced that I do think that, especially the relationship between the main girl and her will they, won't they demon potential lover was a little rushed and a little underdeveloped, but I still followed it and I was cool with where it ended up. But what I thought was most compelling was the main character. She had a really interesting dilemma, and how it affected both the plot and her relationships with her friends and bandmates was really compelling and believable. They also just created a fun, lore-rich world. I thought they established all that lore really well, and it was really interesting. And I'd like to see more from not only this universe, but these characters. I think there's a lot of stories they could tell, and it just has a lot of potential. So I don't understand why this was not released in theaters. It's very strange. I think this would have at least had the potential to be a breakout hit of the summer theatrically, but at least it has an audience, and I'm just, like a lot of people, really excited about whatever Sony does next. Even though I wasn't the biggest fan of Into the Spider-Verse for a lot of its story and pacing and socio-political choices, we'll say, I still think it was a brilliantly crafted film, just like the first one, and I am looking forward to the third one, and I hope that this big break that they gave themselves, where it was originally going to release like a year-ish after Into the Spider-Verse, and then they pushed it way back, I hope that gives them time to refine and adjust some of the things that weren't working in the bloated sequel. And in the meantime, maybe we'll get more K-pop demon hunting. So a few episodes back, I did a episode all about the most popular works of Amy Sherman Palladino and Daniel Palladino, the creatives behind Gilmore Girls and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And I said in that episode how after seeing those two shows in their entirety and enjoying them so thoroughly, how excited I was for whatever the Palladinos were going to do next. And then I heard that they were making this ballet-oriented show for Prime. And though I still hadn't seen the one season of Bunheads, which I believe was the show that predated Gilmore Girls that they had worked on, I did say with Maisel that doing something more specifically dance-related definitely seemed right up their alley, because so much of Maisel felt like it was hearkening to dance-oriented media and musical theater. So I wasn't surprised that that was the subject matter that they were taking on next. And even though I don't have any particular specific interest in the world and industry of ballet, the fact that these creatives had two back-to-back home runs, for me at least, poised me to be open and excited for whatever they did next. So my wife and I sat down and tried to watch, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, I'll let Google Translate do that.
Étoile.
But unfortunately, we only made it through, I don't even think we made it through 2 whole episodes. I've already kind of forgotten, and it's only been a couple weeks. And it's quite possible that we just didn't give it enough of a chance. But as I say a lot on here, I'm very protective of my time that I devote to media consumption because it's limited. And if something doesn't grab me pretty much immediately. And I'm not talking about in an attention span kind of way, where if something is slower or doesn't have like an explosion in the first scene, then, I'm just write it off. I'm not talking about that, because neither Gilmore Girls or Maisel had explosions or particularly fast-paced narratives from the get-go, but they endured us to the characters so immediately, fleshed them out, developed them, set them up to be sympathetic and oftentimes very empathetic and entertaining, compelling. Meanwhile, doing a lot of masterful, small-scale world building around these characters, making their settings just as much as a character as any of the people, that they had my attention and I was drawn into those shows from the get-go. And this show seemed to have most of those ingredients. It had a wide range of very distinct characters and personalities. It had all the great humor, the fast-paced, Aaron Sorkin-esque kind of dialogue, and it set up a story similar to Gilmore Girls especially, that even though the stakes weren't catastrophically dire, because like in Gilmore Girls, it was around wealthy family and to what extent the non-wealthy members would be able to access and what they'd have to sacrifice to participate in that wealth. It was still contextually relevant to the well-being of the characters. So I wasn't expecting some like world-shattering consequences at stake if the characters in this show didn't keep their ballet company alive and well. But the problem was, and again, this could definitely be a symptom of the fact that we just didn't hold on long enough, but I've already addressed that I expect by like more than an hour and a half into a, 6 to 8 episode TV series that I would care about any of the characters. I'm not saying that I was not entertained by them. The writing was top notch, just like it was in Maisel especially, and the way that the scenes were filmed and executed, not just the dialogue, but the framing and the blocking, how it was all very kinetic and fluid, especially like Maisel. The Palladino's fingerprints were all over this. It didn't feel like a departure at all. It's just that all the characters in it, except for this kid that was basically auditing her ballet lessons via her custodial mom's secretive filming of classes, I didn't find the rest of the cast to be sympathetic or really compelling in any way, because they were all pretty despicable, but not in the fun anti-hero way. They were just really pretentious, some of them very pompous, some of them downright sociopathic. And I get that that's what they were going for. And it was funny and entertaining to watch them interact and bounce off each other and despise each other and try to have all these power struggles and dominate decision-making around these ballet companies and stuff. But after we took a break halfway through the second or third episode, both my wife and I looked at each other and agreed that we had no real desire to return to it. We weren't like thinking about it. We weren't wondering what was going to happen. We weren't concerned about the plot lines or the development of any of these characters or the relationships. So maybe we'll go back and finish it at some point just to be the completionist that at least I am. I think my wife would agree. Actually, she'll suffer through a lot more stuff that she freely admits to not really even liking just to see how it ends kind of thing. I've given that up for the most part. It's not that I think the show was bad or not high quality. It really just came down to the most important thing that I think most people, at least casual viewers and consumers of content like myself, I don't know, I guess I'm a little bit more than casual because I do this, but I also don't do this for a living, so it's not like I'm compelled to do it beyond just being entertained and then talking about my feelings about it just because I enjoy doing that. But it's really about the characters. You can have the best idea, the most interesting and well-woven plot, setting, locales, direction, acting, all those things. But if the characters aren't interesting or relatable, well-written, well-developed, for me at least, it's just not worth my time. So I can't deny that I am more than just a little disappointed because my expectations and hopes were so high for the next project from the Palladinos. But this isn't like a James Gunn situation where I've written them off completely. I will definitely check out whatever they make next, but I'll go in with a little bit more cautious optimism. So it's the last day of August, and I haven't had a chance to sit down and catch up on my thoughts for the stuff that I watched throughout the last few weeks of August. It's been a busy month. School started. But it's Labor Day weekend, and I do have a chance to finally catch up. And one thing that I caught up on that was a release back in January of 2025, I believe, was Companion. I've been meaning to get to it, and they finally put it out. I think it was on HBO Max. Got to call it HBO Max now instead of Max, because the overlords have commanded it so. But I remember hearing good things about it, and my wife and I were looking for something fresh to watch, so we agreed on that. And I really liked it. I thought it was very fresh take on a genre that is becoming more and more oversaturated, and that has been popular for a really long time, between Blade Runner, Terminator, Matrix, and then like this explosion of rogue AI or sentient AI oriented stories in the past 5-10 years. So part of me was like expecting just another serviceable version of that. But even though the genre has been done to death, it is such a relevant and topical thing right now. And I am really, really interested, and like a lot of people, a little scared about where we're headed with it. I'm always curious to see what a new writer, a new director's, new artist take is on this subject, and if they have anything new to say about it. And though overall I thought the themes and the ultimate direction of the story and what it was trying to say about sentience and autonomy and agency was a well-worn path, the movie itself was so unique and distinct, definitely in its claustrophobic, isolated setting and the aesthetics, and the quirky characters, but more so in the constant twists and turns and like power shifts of the way that the plot was structured. Even though I knew the setup for the film and the general trajectory, it had me on my toes, and it also had me laughing, but it also had me doing that thing where I'd make some loud, obnoxious, guttural reaction sound to some unexpectedly disgusting, gory thing that would happen from seemingly out of nowhere. And all that together, I found it to be really entertaining. But the thing that I really wanted to mention about it in here is not specific to this movie, but it's just kind of a culmination of an issue that's been around forever, but really makes me question why they keep doing this and when they're going to stop. They meaning the marketing departments that cut the trailers for these things. Because not just like a week before we saw Companion, my wife and I watched Abigail, because that was streaming somewhere. And that too, I'd heard good things about. I don't remember if that came out in 2025 or late 2024. But either way, one reason I didn't rush out to see that, even though I heard generally good things about it, was because of the trailer. I knew from the moment that they told us what it was all about, what the big twist or the hook of the premise really was, that I wasn't going to enjoy the movie as much as I would have had I not known. Same thing with Sinners. And obviously this has been going on forever. Terminator 2 and every subsequent Terminator movie and so on has spoiled the twist or the reveal or the hook in the trailer. And it's obvious they do it. I'm not an idiot, because they don't trust that audiences will go see something on its mysterious premise or the pre-twist premise. They want audience to know as much as possible so they can feel as safe that they're going to be getting what they expect when they go into it. And I understand that. I'll never condone it or like it, but I do understand that. And I know it's mostly my fault for even watching the trailers, but it's such a paradox because the whole point of a trailer is supposed to tease you and whet your appetite and give you an idea about what you're going to see without showing you the whole thing and giving you basically the whole experience in summary. And the thing about it, especially with these genre films, even if they're done uniquely and they have a distinct vision, you know, like Sinners did, the fact that I knew that it was going to be about vampires going into it, I was just waiting for the vampire stuff to happen. When is it going to get here? And then we know vampires. Just like Abigail, we know the broad strokes. And then they can, you know, mess around with the lore and give it its own unique spin and everything. But it's the not knowing part and the big reveal that is the shocking moment, not how they ultimately deal with it. Because, again, we know in these genres how there's a limited number of ways that they can deal with these conflicts. But I'm talking about the viewing experience. So, like a lot of people, I am often terrified to watch a trailer for anything because more often than not, they just lay it out all for you. They give you like all 3 acts, the overall plot thrusts, plot points, character moments. If it's a comedy, they give you the best jokes. But at the same time, I feel like if I don't watch a trailer and I go in totally blind, then really, why would I do that? I mean, yeah, it's one thing to say, okay, some big tentpole movie like Jurassic Park or Aliens or something, Harry Potter. You don't need to see a trailer because you know essentially what you're going to get out of it. It's just a matter of, or a question of quality. But with these smaller films, horror, drama, comedy, the trailer should be giving you some insight into the overall tone, the main characters, at least the setup for the main conflict, but like that's it. So what I'm saying is, even though I really enjoyed Companion and I thought Abigail was a lot of fun, I really think I would have enjoyed them more had I not seen the trailer. But I don't think I would have watched them at all if I intentionally avoided the trailer, because I would have had no sense of what I was getting myself into. So I don't know what the answer is there other than trust your audience. If you are a good marketing department, you can make a trailer that is intriguing enough without spilling all the beans. And then, yeah, maybe you won't have like the biggest opening weekend because Sinners or Abigail doesn't have like the ardent vampire fan base that will go see anything vampire related in the opening weekend. But once the movie actually comes out and the cat's out of the bag, then word of mouth spreads and you have like a sleeper hit. I know that's a bigger risk, but art is risky. Connecting with audiences is a risk. And I think with the current landscape of Hollywood right now, where even their big tentpole things aren't making them nearly as much money as they did even just a few years ago, they're going to have to take some kind of risk. Maybe starting with the marketing would be a good way to dip their toes into showing audiences respect again. All right, so in the part 1 of this episode, I talked about Squid Game 2, so obligatorily I have to talk about Squid Game 3, which is really obnoxious that they did that. They literally cut one season in half. Why not just do the thing that they've been doing for a while now on Netflix, which is give us like 2 chunks of a season in 2 different time chunks, like Stranger Things Season 4 did, Wednesday's doing right now. Why call it 2 and 3? It's just weird. Because all 2 did was just hit the midpoint of all these arcs, and then Season 3 more or less got to the end of them, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And I don't know, I don't really have a lot of pretext here. I mean, if you go back to part 1 of my 2025 Roundup on this podcast, I talked a lot more about Season 1, my feelings about that, and Season 2. So just jumping straight into 3 or 2.5, my overall reaction that I'll start with is, what was the point of all that? And I heard recently, I didn't see the quote, but I heard somebody quote it from an interview, an article or something, where the creator of their show said that they didn't originally have anything planned past Season 1, and they weren't expecting it to be so globally popular and such a phenomena. So I totally get it, why they weren't really sure what to do with this and why it was so meandering, because we've seen that before, like with the Defenders verse, which you can hear more about on an earlier episode where I talked about the Marvel Netflix Defenders verse. I'm sure that Netflix or whoever the main production company was ordered a certain amount of content for the 2nd and 3rd season, and they just kind of had to scramble and conjure up stuff. But if you did listen to the last episode, you heard me say that going into Season 2, I wasn't very excited, but the beginning of Season 2 I found to be some of the best content of the show up till that point, because it was moving the story forward and it built off of what had happened before, but it was taking things in a slightly different direction. And then even though our main character, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name or look it up right now, goes back into the games, which I knew was going to happen, I thought it was under really interesting circumstances. But then throughout the rest of the season, he's kind of sidelined. And it really wasn't until the very end where they staged their revolt where I thought, okay, things are finally narratively picking up where the beginning of the season set up, that things were going to move forward and they were going to change the status quo of this show. But then, annoyingly, the rest of Season 3 was finishing the games and continuing to draw out the guys on the boat looking for the island story way, way, way past any kind of relevance I mean, that storyline petered out after like a couple of cutaways in the second season. And the fact that they just kept going back to that, and they spent so much time with like the suspicion around the captain, and then going to his house to find evidence. And then, by the way, don't shoot a dog. Don't do that. Why? I hate that. Don't do that. Ugh. It's like, it's one thing to cynically and nihilistically kill off hordes of characters as part of your story about how hopeless and abhorrent people are under the worst circumstances. Sure, fine, whatever. But don't kill the dog. That was so unnecessary. But man, we knew where all that was going to go from like the moment that we had an inkling that there was somebody on the inside or on the boat. And then we were just waiting for it to happen. But meanwhile, there was like so little character development or any real drama. That was just like looking at drone footage and staring off at the horizon and looking at maps. And it's like, we get it. It really felt like filler. Like, I mean, it was like the most filling of filler, which is kind of ironic when we call it filler, because really what it is like completely empty. It's like nothing. It's a waste of time. And speaking of hordes of people unceremoniously or maybe kind of ceremoniously getting killed off, I know that's kind of like the whole point of the show, is to have all these creative and breathtaking ways that they can find to murder people. But I think it was the same episode or maybe a pair of episodes where they kill off so many main characters. It reminded me of like Walking Dead, where I just got numb to it. I already knew most of these people or all of these people were going to die anyway. But when it's just like one after another, it's like you're still supposed to be shocked and mourning one person, and then before you even have a chance to kind of wrap your head around that and how it's going to affect the story and the other characters that are still hanging on, then you have another one and another one. But speaking of characters that I was supposed to care about but seriously didn't, which is horrible to say because I'm a parent, but that baby, that obviously distractingly, uncannily CGI baby that they kept having to show, why didn't they just obscure its face? He had it in that big bundle, but they kept having to show this little baby, which, by the way, if anybody watching this show has had a baby, it's not just the fact that it was CGI, which is fine because, you know, I would hate to think of an actual infant being on the set for this incredibly intense and gory atmosphere that they were filming in day to day. I'm not saying they should have had an actual real live baby at all, but it was just so distracting to look at. And anybody that's ever dealt with one, it would not have hung in that long in such a constantly like changing and jostling and uncomfortable, but also infrequently fed environment. It wouldn't just been sitting there all docile, whimpering and crying every once in a while. That baby would have been living in an absolute nightmare, more so than the adults, because it was relying on those adults to take care of it, and everybody was distracted and some of them trying to unalive it. But man, that just took me out of it every single time that they cut back to that baby's face, or every time that our main character would be like playing one of the games and jostling it around, and it's just sitting there. Meh. Oh my God, what were they thinking with that? But through all of that criticism, which I know I'm not saying anything new or profound, for me personally, the reason that I stuck with this show, because you heard me say in the last episode, if you listen to it, you can always go back and do that before you continue with this one, I only watched season 2 after being underwhelmed with the ending of season 1 and deciding that I wasn't going to watch season 2 unless it had some big profound thing to say or big change. And then when I heard that it was just going to be the games again, I was like, nope, I'm out. But my son really wanted to watch it. He wanted to watch it with me. So I was like, all right, I'll give it a chance. And in contradiction to what I just said about
Étoile,
I am a completionist when I feel that there is at least something that I can get from it in a holistic sense, even if it's not in the moment-to-moment entertainment or character relation and stuff like that. In this case, from the get-go of this show, I was really curious to see what it was all about thematically. Like, what was the big picture? What were they trying to say? What was this all leading to? And yeah, I knew it was going to be about big questions about, are people inherently good or bad? When it really comes down to it, you know, are we just animals with no real loyalties or respect for life, where it's all about just survival? Or are we better than that? At our core, do we default in the very end to the good, to what's not just best for ourselves, but the group, the pack, the tribe? And I just wanted to see where they would go with that. I didn't have my hopes up that it was going to be really profound or unique or even all that interesting, especially after the ending of season 1. But I just wanted to see what at all they were trying to say with all of this. And the ending was so muddled and weirdly underdeveloped after all this time spent with these characters. For one thing, I totally forgot that our main character had a teenage daughter at this point. And I haven't watched season 1 since it came out, so that's on me. But it's a little bit on the show for not reinforcing that that was of any kind of importance to our main character, so that it would have a emotionally satisfying payoff when his final items, whatever, were delivered to her and his fortune. It was just sort of like a, who's this? Oh, yeah, he has a daughter. Oh, what was their relationship? That whole epilogue just felt so tacked on. And why in the wide, wide world of sports did the older brother give his younger cop brother the baby? That wasn't set up at all. That guy has been through so much, and now he has to raise a kid that he didn't even know existed until he found his brother and they like exchanged a look. And by the way, what a completely uneventful and disappointing conclusion to their storyline. How was that a climax to all that time spent on this boat, looking for his brother, being so dedicated and tenacious and single-minded and bullheaded about his cause? Then he finds his brother and they just like look at each other. What did it mean? Why did any of that happen? And then the older brother's, I guess, character arc, that he was like out. I think that's what they were implying. And the fact that he gave the winnings of that second game to his brother along with a baby, as if it was some kind of, I don't know, amends or penance or something. Were we supposed to get that he saw the error of his ways or the error of the games or anything like that? And I don't know what to make of Oscar-winning Cate Blanchett being a little tease for what is obviously meant to be like the next iteration of the game's stateside. Oh, why? This is the law of diminishing returns, folks. It's like they went in production with this. Maybe it was rushed. I don't know, because it's been a long time since season 1 came out, but they obviously didn't have a good ending and a point to all this. So instead of that, instead of tying things up, making it worth our time in regards to this narrative, they're just kind of passing the buck and saying, well, this just kind of petered out, but it's going to keep going with a different location and a recognizable star, I guess. So that'll be interesting, right? Like, that felt more like a total, I don't know, carrot to just lead us on to the next pointless thing, as opposed to like a natural, organic, or even interesting setup to anything. Also, the fact that we spent so much more time with the VIPs, who the acting, or at least the ADR, was so atrocious, just like the first season. But that was all so silly and campy, and the lines sounded like they were written by AI. Like, they just said everything in the most like sinister and callous way that anybody possibly could, and it was just so repetitive and nothing that they were just like caricatures, which I know it was supposed to be satirizing anybody that could or would be in a position to do something like that, but it didn't work. Because it was so, just like the first season, so tonally different than anything else in the show. And it was so mismanaged and poorly written. But at the very least, I was interested to see what they were going to do with those people. Like, for instance, instead of our main character sacrificing himself at the end to save the baby, that I thought he and maybe somebody else, like the father of the baby, could form some kind of reluctant alliance and find a way to confront the VIPs and have the upper hand. Just anything that was more than just them being there, being total horrible monsters, and then just getting away and us never seeing them again. What did that mean? What was the point? I really think that the writers had our main character sacrifice himself and leave that like eternal ellipsis. I think it was the name of the episode, like humans are or people are ... I think they left that open and ambiguous, not because it was the organic and appropriate conclusion for the show, but that they literally didn't know what they were going to do with this. And so they just are trying to trick us into thinking that it's deeper than it really is. So Yeah, there were things that I liked about both of these seasons. They were very intense. The games themselves were very creative, and I was on the edge of my seat just by concept and execution, even though I wasn't like particularly scared for or sympathizing with any characters in particular. Just putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about how horrific those situations are really did make it like pulse inducing. And I thought there were some good narrative ideas, especially beginning of season 2 and the end of season 2, but they ultimately didn't lead to anything or go anywhere, at least anywhere interesting. I'm sure there are going to be, or already are, a lot of analyses and drawing parallels to other works of fiction or things in real life and all the stuff that YouTube does. But when it comes down to it, my consumption of any media, from music to movies, TV to books, comics, video games, everything in between, it's all about, in the end, how it makes me feel. Because that's why I consume this stuff, to get emotional responses from it. That's my reason. I know it's not everybody's. But in this case, this show made me feel nothing to disappointment and frustration. So I am not at all interested in whatever they're going to do next, even if Cate Blanchett is in it, slapping people in the face. Of course, as usual, I'll keep my ear to the ground and I'll listen to reviews and things and just see what people have to say as this franchise inevitably continues. And if somebody says, oh my gosh, it's brilliant, it's all been leading up to this, it was all worth it for whatever this next thing is, then I'll give it a chance, because I'm not a totally hard-hearted cynic, not yet. But I would say that I'm not really a Squid Game fan at this point. I don't remember if this was released late last year or early 2025. But another show that I've been meaning to get to, that my wife actually watched without me, how dare her, but she liked so much that she wanted to experience it with me for a second time, was Fallout. And this is one that I heard nothing but good things about. I have zero knowledge of or experience with the games, so I went into this mostly blind and ignorant, except for the fact that I heard some reviews and things where they discussed a little bit of the plot and the characters. So like, I knew that Walter Goggins was playing the Ghoul and he looked like Skeletor, and that it was about people in fallout shelters or maybe leaving those fallout shelters. I knew that it was based on a video game, so it was going to be stylized, maybe hyper stylized, but I had no idea how much over the top, hyper gory it was going to be, and shockingly so, to the point that I got kind of numb to it after a while. And it really made me curious to play any of the games, which I hope to get to at some point, just to see if that is just part of this franchise or if they amp that up for the show because it was part of the creative vision. I just am curious. But who knows when I'll actually have time to sit down and play a new video game, let alone any of my nowadays referred to as retro games, which you can see me play now and then on YouTube, youtube.com/breathingunderwater. But yeah, what I found interesting about that aspect of it right off the bat was, with this very stylized, sometimes hyper stylized world and characters, I went into it expecting a lot more cartoony, over the top zaniness when it came to the plot and the stakes. So I was surprised to find that generally it's pretty grounded and gritty in regards to this world and how visceral it is and how serious they took it. It's not like an overly dramatic show or melodramatic necessarily, but again, I was surprised that it wasn't more tongue-in-cheek and like campy. It took itself seriously, and that's why, in that regard, because there are some things like Cabin in the Woods or Something in Dale, I can't remember the name of that movie now, where it's like two bumpkin guys are just trying to like go about their business, but they keep accidentally being privy to like teen murders. What was that called? It'll come back to me at some point. But my point is that those kind of things are so over the top and cartoony that the violence is just part of the shtick and you can't take it seriously. But in this show, because the show was taking itself so seriously and had such a somber tone through a lot of it, with a little bit of a slower pace too than I was expecting, which is fine because it helped build tension and drama and intrigue and mystique and everything. The violence was so over the top that it was disturbing to me, and I don't know if they really meant it to come off that way. I can't tell. A good example is the scene where the main girl, of course I can't think of her name right now because my brain is totally fried for whatever reason. Oh yeah, I just had my first week back at school. She's trying to take on the ghoul, and she had cut off his finger earlier, so he reciprocates and slices off her finger, and it's gross and disturbing, and it's not like a casual, oh, it's just a flesh wound. I mean, especially in this world with how dirty, and when you're outside of the fallout shelters, you don't have access to like modern medicine and stuff. I just figure that infection is probably one of the leading killers, if not radiation poisoning, of course. But also, like, in this world where, you know, it's survival of the fittest, you need all your 10 fingers to be at your best. And if you don't have those, that's a big problem. But also just the fact that she was a really endearing, optimistic, peppy, hopeful character. And she had something so brutal and violent done to her. It was just, like I said, very visceral. Like, it hit me on a level of empathy and maybe very uncomfortable. And there was lots of moments like that. Like when, again, I don't know the character's name, of course, but Ben from Lost gets his foot horribly, disgustingly blown off, and he's kind of casual about it, and then they like have to force this robot prosthetic foot on him, and you can tell that it's like very painful. I think they were going for a more silly tone with that kind of stuff, especially because like the characters don't seem to react to it the way that an actual person would react to it. But I couldn't separate that from the tone, which was not silly and cartoonish. So I'm not saying this is like a good or bad thing. It's not really a criticism yet because there's still more of this story to go. But the world itself, I can't really tell if I feel good about it in a consistency way. I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to find this more casually silly and over the top, or if it's supposed to really be hitting home on this body horror level. But it's kind of leaning the latter for me right now. It's really gross. But like I said, at this point, that's not really a judgment. It was just something that really stood out to me. But other things that really stood out to me are the visuals. My wife heard me say so many times they would go to some new set piece or new locale. I would just be like, wow, they obviously like put their money on the screen here. There's amazing set design and costuming, and the whole world feels so lived in, whether it's the extreme immaculate sanitation and sterility, is that a word? The sterileness of the shelters, to the totally opposite end of the spectrum, the disgusting, grimy, dilapidated wasteland above. It really feels lived in, and it really feels like real. I was really, really impressed. And the effects too. I mean, some of the creature effects were a little too CGI dependent, like the thing with the fingers in its mouth that was in the lake. Obviously CGI, but still really good CGI. I was not taken out of my immersion completely at any point. And yeah, we're on the cusp of season 2 coming out, and I'm really excited to see it. I really did enjoy this show. Thought it was great on every level in terms of the craft, from the style to the scripts and the storytelling. The characters are so well realized and interesting and dynamic. There's so much going on with them, so much backstory, so much intrigue. I could go through and just talk about them, but that's not really worth your or my time here, because I don't think I'd be saying anything particularly interesting or unique about it. I don't have any big takes on it. I'm just really entertained by the show and really excited to see where it goes. But there is one character that I do want to say something about, because when it comes down to it, the reason that I do this podcast and the other kind of like reactionary stuff that I do on all the different branches of this podcast, from music to Selkie lore and on my YouTube channel, they're really ways for me to kind of process and explore these crafts deeper and kind of document my journey with it, my thought patterns and all that kind of stuff, so that I can be a better, whatever it is, writer, musician, or content creator. And in this case, the thing that really stood out to me on that front, the thing that I really feel like I could learn a lot from, is the writing of the ghoul. I love how he's not just a standard anti-hero or antagonist. He's so in this gray area of just a character that is kind of out for himself and has his own ambitions and goals, but he doesn't seem particularly interested in cruelness, but he will do horrible things with seemingly not a second thought because that's just kind of who he is. But we get all this great backstory with so much intrigue and so much development of his character that they've made him into such an incredible, sympathetic character that not only do us as an audience see that side of him, and even though the other characters that are more good at heart, at least in this modern world that they live in, and they don't know about his backstory and everything, but they get little glimpses. So it's not just we're learning about things that don't matter. Because you see that a lot, like you get backstory for villains and things, and it's like, okay, well, this explains why they're doing what they're doing, but it doesn't change a relationship between them and the protagonist or whatever. In this case, though, I feel like the more sympathetic we are with him from his journey that led him to where he is now, even if the main characters in the present don't get to know all that, it makes him and his journey all that more impactful, and his dynamics with the other characters more nuanced and dynamic than if his backstory was only implied. I'm not huge on filling shows with a lot of flashback stuff just to kind of flesh out the character. But in this case, I feel like they're being so smart and so calculated with how they're giving us pieces of his journey to lead him to where he is. And with that, there's so much intrigue around him. I'm so curious to see how he became who he is now based on who we know that he started as before the original Fallout, and how he became so corrupted, because we're really following the journey of like two different characters from two different times, but they are also the conglomeration of this one person's experiences. And it's just so deep and rich and so compelling. But him by himself, I don't think would be as compelling without this amazing opposite end of the spectrum foil that we're given in, what's her name, our main character from the bunkers, because she pushes him and challenges him. She's got so much resolve and tenacity that she doesn't just take him at face value. No pun intended, face, haha. But I just love that. I haven't seen that kind of writing in something as long as I can remember. I'm so fascinated with their dynamic and how they aren't just on this road trip together as like reluctant sidekicks, you know, that are on a similar goal, journey, path, and they're going to bicker and be all zany and stuff and cut off each other's fingers just for the surface humor and entertainment from that. But that her character, you can tell, is specifically written to enhance and challenge his character, and vice versa. Because I almost feel like right now, knowing his backstory and knowing that he was a hopeful, constructive person with his own value system and resolve and integrity around what he saw as good and bad and acceptable, and then knowing where he ended up, now we're given this other character, younger, more susceptible, less experienced, but we're already starting to see cracks in her optimism armor as she gets more real and tragic experiences in this real world. And it begging the question for me right now, is she going to end up like him? Or is he going to be able to find his real self because of her? They're both so stubborn and righteous in so many ways, but we can also see that they're both corruptible. And it's just brilliant writing. I'm so interested in this. I'm willing to look past all of the incredibly uncomfortable, shocking, and disgusting body horror and violence and everything, which isn't usually my cup of tea, to see where this goes. So I'll keep you posted, but so far, Fallout is one of the best shows and most challenging shows that I've watched since, like, The Shield. So even though it's still August and not officially fall yet, my wife and I have decided to start getting into the Halloween feels as early as possible. So we decided to watch Nosferatu, which was on Prime, I think. And if you want to hear my more detailed thoughts about that, I did that on part 1 of this 2-part episode. But the reason I bring that up right now is because the Aaron Taylor Johnson's wife in the movie was an actress that I didn't recognize. My wife said, "Oh, that's the girl from that show about the murder at the end of the world, Iceland, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She was sure she had watched it with me, but I had no idea what she was talking about. So I don't know, must be one of those Mandela effect things or something. So she was like, "Okay, well, we need to watch this show because I think you're going to like it." And I didn't realize until we started watching it that it was by the same people that made the OA. And I've talked about the OA a few times on a few different episodes on here, especially talking around my love-hate relationship with modern television shows and their writing and their structure and all that kind of stuff. Because the OA was a show that was recommended to me because it was so weird and interesting, and somebody that had watched it when it was first airing was like, "I really want to talk about this with somebody, but I don't know anybody that watched it, so will you please watch it so we can talk about it?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." Even though I was really over it at the time, and still am in a lot of ways, even though I know I talk about a lot of popular TV shows on here. But that's just because people keep pulling me in. It's like the TV mob every time I think I'm out. So yeah, I watched the OA the first season, and then the second season came out. And even though I found the show to be very odd and not always my cup of tea, I was curious to see where it went and what it was all leading to. And I'd heard that there was a planned 5-season arc. So I was like, okay, they obviously have a plan for this, so I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then it got unceremoniously canceled on one of the biggest and most shocking cliffhangers ever. And if you haven't seen the OA, I'm not really recommending it necessarily, even though I think there's a lot of good stuff in it and a lot of things that could be enjoyed. But the fact that it was canceled early and it didn't get to resolve, that cliffhanger at the end of season 2, it's going to bug me till the day I die. Like, it's so annoying that Netflix was like, "Meh, we'll invest all this time and money into this artist's vision and then not let them get to finish it because screw audiences." And I'll just never forgive them for that because I need to know where they were going with this. I don't know where they could have gone with it from where they left it off. Anyway, apparently this was that creative duo's work as well. And as usual, I don't know their names. I know the name of the show a lot of times, and that's about it. When I sit down to actually record these things, I'm using my phone to record, and I don't feel like interrupting or potentially interrupting the recording process to go search up stuff on IMDb. You can look that stuff up. You don't need me to spoon feed it to you, right? But anyway, I had literally no idea what to expect from this show. Only that I asked my wife, like, "Is this going to be as weird and disturbing as the OA?" And she said, "Yeah, kinda." So I thought I was in for some other like head trip of an experience. I had no idea about any of the characters, the plot, the setting, nothing. I just knew what it was called. A Murder at the End of the World. And that Clive Owen is in it. And I haven't seen him in anything forever. And I always liked him, so I was curious to see what his role would be. Oh, he's a creepy, overbearing, mysterious tech genius trillionaire? Ugh, didn't see that one coming. Anyway. So yeah, I was shocked to find that there was no huge twist or dimension jumping angel stuff or anything like that. It was just a straight up murder mystery with basically the same setup as like Glass Onion, but also very somber, pretty slow, but astoundingly shot in the stark, snowy mountaintops of Iceland. So it looked great. The acting was good. And I don't really have any major reactions to it, honestly, like I did to the OA, at least in terms of the story or the themes or anything, because like I said, I thought it was a pretty straightforward, surprisingly so, because my wife mentioned that it was going to get weird, and I was just expecting things to take some big turn or twist or something, but they never really did. And I guess she was like, "Oh, I guess I thought that those mining robots were weird." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, I see what you mean." But it's not OA weird, not even close. Linear, yeah, it had some like dream sequences and stuff, but it wasn't a head trip at all. I followed everything just fine. I wasn't left with my mouth agape and like, what the heck is this? Like I was with the OA. And I thought the characters were generally pretty good. It's just that the whole show was in the point of view of our pink-haired main girl, which is fine. And I really like that when something has a particular and unique and consistent point of view as opposed to throwing us around with a bunch of other characters. and not really having a singular focus. But what it did do, in this case at least, was make most of the other characters a little more, not necessarily one-dimensional, but just underdeveloped. I didn't really feel like we ever really got to know most of the other characters with any kind of like 2 or 3 dimensional depth. There were good dynamics between people, but also our main character was such an introvert and so isolated that she often spent a lot of time avoiding people, which made sense for her character, but just in terms of getting to know everybody else. And looking at it now, I guess that does make sense because it's a murder mystery and we're supposed to be cut off from and questioning everybody. I get that, but it just made me feel like a lot of these other people were just kind of background characters. A couple of them, they mentioned names and things a few times, and I forgot who they were even talking about or that they existed because they were hardly fleshed out or killed off right away. But as it was going along, and because I was expecting a little bit more weirdness because of my wife's comment, I was a bit whelmed at the fact that it was basically following the same trajectory as stuff like Dan Brown's Origin, which was another rogue AI story, and Upgrade, which I talked about in the first part of this episode, and a multitude of other technology and AI-oriented Matrix-esque kind of stories about the nature of humanity and our interactions with technology and who's really in control, yada, yada, yada. It was all pretty tried and tested, well executed, and had a lot of really good tense moments and sense of danger. You obviously know who the killer was, but it was taken very seriously, not cartoonishly like the Knives Out stuff or Clue or something. But I guess what I'm saying is overall, I was expecting a little bit more risk and, I don't know, crazy big swings from this creative duo that also made the OA. But at the same time, maybe this was kind of the point of this show, was to show that they could do something more straightforward and linear and grounded because of what I guess we could consider a failure of the OA because it was canceled, and maybe they wanted to, or were given the opportunity to do something more straightforward. So that was my own expectations going into it. And I'm not saying that I would prefer that they do something like the OA again. I mean, this was expertly done. But in terms of the overall story and everything, I really don't feel like it broke any new ground or had anything very unique to say about the situation that the characters found themselves in because of the AI. It was a unique way to plot it out and to find out eventually who the quote-unquote murderer was, and that was actually pretty disturbing because that's going to have lasting impact on a certain character's life should they ever find out what they were inadvertently manipulated to do. But otherwise, it was pretty much a Terminator, Matrix, etc. warning parable about the dangers of technology and us becoming dependent on and then losing control of, the arrogance of thinking that we can create things without there being life-altering consequences, playing God and all that such stuff, all that stutch, But the reason that I am talking about it here is because it did have a very visceral effect on me as an individual, because as I alluded to earlier, I know this show isn't particularly new. I think it came out a couple years ago, but every day I feel like we're getting closer and closer to some kind of tipping point with AI. And I'm not talking about necessarily Skynet or anything, but just this show did a really good job of presenting one of the many more and more likely scenarios of how the more that we give of our agency and autonomy to cold, logical, calculating algorithms, the more we're setting ourselves up for failure or tragedy or whatever. Right now, I'm not as worried and not trying to be an alarmist, but I do work in this STEM field. I'm a STEM teacher, and I obviously am a technology adopter and user, but I'm also a skeptic. And I never want to conflate things to having more importance than they inherently do, or more value. I make things and I use technology, including AI, to certain degrees. I use AI assistants to help with menial tasks. I'll use generative AI to visually iterate things that I couldn't do with my own 2 hands and brain because I'm not an illustrator. But I just try to be aware of what it is, how it works, and what the implications are, including the ethics and morality of it, but more so what it means in terms of being a human. Because as much as I enjoy producing content and love my job and working with young people and exposing them to these tools and these concepts, I also don't believe deep down in my heart that any of this stuff is truly important to the human experience. Yes, there are a myriad of examples and arguments that people can make for how these things advance medicine and other areas of, important human survival and productivity, like food production, goods and services, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, all of these things have consequences to the environment, to our brains, to our bodies, to being human. And so what I try to do is not just take all of this stuff as a given or as like an inherent, it's like, well, this thing exists now, so that means it's good. It's more like this thing exists now, so where are we going with it? And is it something that is necessary? And I think this show did a good job of exploring that aspect of it. I think that's why, even though I didn't find it to be incredibly profound or new or unique or anything, it did speak to me in that it gave a little bit of insight into what the alternative is. Even though some of the interactions and discussions around the theme were a little on the nose, like for instance, when in the flashbacks, when our main character and her boyfriend are investigating this serial killer trail, and she's just so obsessed with the case and she's on her phone constantly, and he is falling in love with her and he really wants to get to know her as an individual, but he feels like she's distracted and unavailable a lot of time. I thought it was pretty obvious and on the nose when he was like, everybody's on their phones these days. Like, yeah, we already know that. As a writer, I don't know if I would be apt to just have my characters like say things that are bad about things, because it just sounds like the writer talking to the audience. And I thought it was interesting that it's not so simple, that she mentioned that it was that technology and her phone that helped her first interact with him and fall in love with him. So she saw it with more value than his very dismissive and kind of condescending feelings about all of it. But at the same time, now that they were together, did they really need that stuff? Was it helping? And then so I thought it was a lot more profound and well executed. Instead of somebody having to say something, is when she found his laptop and phone in the bathtub and took them out and then put them back in. That definitely felt like a well executed, visualized character moment of development for her. And I really connected with that. I thought that was really interesting. And it informed us about where she was now. So yeah, interesting stuff. I am definitely interested to see what this creative duo does in the future. I just hope that they don't avoid taking risks, because those big swings that they took with the OA ultimately didn't fully succeed. Maybe a middle ground between something a little bit more grounded, like A Murder at the End of the World, and the OA is not the worst thing in the world. So if you listened to part 1 of this series this year, you heard me talk a lot about my reactions to Superman trailers and the conversation around that. And it's August, almost September, and I hopefully, obviously, decided not to see Superman, because if I had, I would have talked about it by now. And that's what I mentioned before, was that I was only going to see it if, once the reviews started coming out, that they let me know in full certainty that I would not be wasting my time and money and energy on a completely just self-indulgent James Gunn project. I love how the Critical Drinker has been calling it James Gunn's Superman by James Gunn, because that was my biggest worry. Not that they were going to mess with lore, or even that it would have some humor and levity, which was lacking, in the Snyder side of the Snyderverse when it came to Superman, but that it would be distinctly a James Gunn movie, which I've said I have liked most of the stuff that I've seen of his. And I saw his stuff before Guardians, like Super and Slither. And with the exception of Guardians 1, though, looking back now, I don't think there's anything that I've seen of his that I've absolutely loved and adored and I responded to with a total fandom attitude. If anything, Guardians was like the peak of what he excels at, and everything after that was just more of the same. It was like he was building up to that, and you could see inklings of where he was going. And then he did Guardians. He did like his magnum opus. And then it was so successful, it's just been like rinse and repeat. But that doesn't mean that I haven't liked other stuff that he's done or haven't found value in it. I like the Suicide Squad just fine. Definitely like it more than the original. And I liked parts of the other Guardians movies quite a bit. But I've never felt like James Gunn is this visionary, this auteur, and definitely, as I've said many, many times, does not feel like the right person to be in charge of DC. Yes, definitely put him in a director's role, have him make more Suicide Squad movies or Justice Gang movies or Clayface, whatever. Like, have him do his weird stuff, but not the architect. He's too himself, and he's proven himself to be a very pompous and ego-driven creative, which isn't like a huge shocker in Hollywood or anything, but a little bit of humility and a little bit of collaboration would be nice when it comes to engineering these huge franchises, which was such a breath of fresh air when Kevin Feige took over at Marvel originally, even though he's really dropped the ball. But at the time, he really had a lot of good stuff to say about, I'm not a director, I rely on good talent to help guide this vision that I have and execute it and stuff like that. Like, he had a lot of really constructive stuff to say, and he showed it by, you know, bringing in all this great talent and helping orchestrate it, and then also giving them freedom to make good stuff. And it worked for a while, for a good long while. They had their run. But James Gunn has never just showed that. He's a director and writer that has a very distinct voice, and I just really think that like everything Warner Brothers has done ever since the Avengers was reactive. They've always just been reactive, and then they've had this opportunity to reboot. Totally get that. The Snyderverse just never found its footing because it didn't have a good foundation. And, you know, I got to say, like, I have been vying for the DC universe from the beginning, more so than Marvel, even though I've enjoyed what Marvel has done more because they've done a better job executing it. But my real love, for the most part, lies in DC characters from my childhood. Superman, Batman, Swamp Thing, Robin, and the whole Rogues Gallery. And even though I wasn't as privy to the deeper lore and everything, I was partial to The Flash, even Wonder Woman to an extent. Those characters always meant more to me and continue to on the page than Tony Stark or even Captain America, and characters that I grew to love through the MCU when it was at its peak. But that came as an adult. And if you're listening to this, you're probably more like me, where a lot of the things that you still love and devote time and nostalgic energy to are things that hit you when you were a kid and that have stuck with you, and you really want to see done well and done right and given their due credit on the big screen. And I just never felt like James Gunn was the guy to do that, especially in a holistic sense. And that's all I kept hearing from both sides. I didn't hear that from the people that liked it, that it was anything other than a standard James Gunn-esque kind of thing. And then the people that didn't like it because it was a standard James Gunn kind of thing. So I just had no desire to see it. All my fears from all the marketing sounded like they were true, and if you think that that's short-sighted or ignorant or I'm unworthy to even have an opinion on it because I haven't actually seen it, I get that. But we live in this time where you don't really have to see things anymore to really assess at least the quality of it. I mean, who knows? Maybe I'll actually watch Superman someday and enjoy it just for what it is. I'm not making the judgment that I like it or hate it, or that it's good or bad based on what I heard about it, because I haven't experienced it directly, and I don't judge things that I haven't experienced directly. I try not to. But there was one thing that I didn't want from this movie, which was a typical James Gunn experience. I don't want a James Gunn feeling Superman. I want Superman. And I know that a lot of people have said that the Superman character is the one thing that got right, no matter what else. But Superman as a character is only part of the story. There's also all of his supporting cast and his villains. And I just don't care about the Justice Gang. I love Nathan Fillion, and I don't want to see him just do more Mal from Firefly and Serenity quip, jokey kind of stuff just because he's a friend of James Gunn. I just don't have any desire to see this movie. But what I did have a desire to see, despite all of this, was season 2 of Peacemaker, because I watched season 1 and enjoyed it. I didn't love it, but there was a lot about it that I really liked. The things that I liked about it the least were the most James Gunn-y stuff, where his characters would try to have a conversation but keep getting sidetracked and marred with arguing and bickering about like totally non sequitur, off-topic stuff, just because that's how people talk all the time, right? But I found the show entertaining and fun, and I liked seeing John Cena stretch his acting muscles a little bit. And I was willing to give season 2 a shot until I heard, and I saw the writing on the wall when this first all went down, when he fired everybody from Gal Gadot to Henry Cavill and wiped the slate clean of the DC EU, except for Peacemaker, of course, because that was his thing. And I'm really not going to be surprised if he brings back like Idris Elba, what was it, Bloodsport, Bloodshot, Blood-Eyed, one, whatever, and Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, and those other characters from the Suicide Squad, because that's his thing, one of his babies. And I get it, you know, he didn't want to like start from scratch on everything, but I was nervous that singling out that one character and carrying him over, but negating the rest of the continuity would put him in an awkward position where he'd have to justify it. And it sounds like, from what I've heard, again, I haven't watched it and I'm not rushing out to, and that's the point of me talking about this right now, is just to say that I had mentioned this stuff before, and I just wanted to circle back to it and let you know why I didn't ultimately watch it. And in this case, it sounds like there's some multiverse buffoonery with why Peacemaker is brought over from the DCEU, but no Cavill, no Affleck. But you still get to have John Cena. And, you know, Marvel has ruined the whole multiverse potential in at least live action comic book adaptations for the time being. So it really does not sound like anything that I'd be interested in, to see a multiversal Peacemaker in a new context, for the sole reason that James Gunn that he couldn't follow through with what he said he was going to do, which was wipe the slate clean and start over, which I didn't want anyway. I've never been interested in a James Gunn helmed DCU. No matter what talent he brings in, we're off to a James Gunny start. I was hoping for, like I said, more of a return to comic book form and the essence of these characters instead of the egos of these filmmakers. And that's not what they decided to do. But at least with Peacemaker, that was going to continue, and I was curious about it until I find out that it's just more James Gunn getting to do whatever he wants stuff. So no thank you. I'm out on DC right now. And also, I got to say, how does he expect to build any hype if he is not going to fast track his major players? I'm sure we'll get cameos and we'll get eventual solo or team up movies, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, Cyborg, more Green Lanterns. But if the next things on the slate are Supergirl, Clayface, and is it Swamp Thing, I think, in addition to an eventual Batman Brave and the Bold, which is way too much too soon. If they want to do a Matt Reeves Batman 2 sequel and do a DCU separate Batman, which is ridiculous, way too convoluted and unnecessary. And at the very least, they need to have a simple introduction to Batman and do it a lot better than they did in Batman vs. Superman. But instead, they're going to clutter it up with the Brave and the Bold cast, which is like extensive, and they're going to have a lot of setup to do, a lot of crazy stuff going on, and just too many characters. So I'm not excited about any of this. I love Clayface in the animated series and the comics. Swamp Thing was one of my original comic books that I ever bought. Unbeknownst to my parents, it was very adult, and they just thought it was like a comic book superhero thing, and I found it kind of disturbing and traumatic as a kid, but I also really thought it was an interesting premise. And there was a show on Sci-Fi too, I remember, that I liked at the time. But why do these offbeat secondary characters when you have all these main players that you could start over with and get right? Show us like, okay, the Snyderverse didn't work out, but here's good versions of these characters. Establish a good, solid universe, and then you can start to sprinkle in all this other weird stuff. but I just feel like there's going to be no momentum. Like, you start with Superman, like the biggest superhero of all time, and then you're going to give us Clayface? That's the follow-up? Or even Supergirl? No, not interested. Sorry, DC, but you picked the wrong guy. Just like with Zack Snyder, why are you getting these directors to be producers? I'm out. So The Monkey is out on Hulu right now as I record this. And I wasn't able to catch it in theaters, but I heard generally good things about it over the summer, so I thought it might be another good horror comedy to start the early pre-season for Halloween. And also somebody recommended it to me at work the other day too, so thought I'd give it a chance. Now, I didn't see Longlegs, but I generally heard okay things about it. Pretty mixed though, so I really wasn't rushing out to see that one either. And I'm sure I'll catch it at some point, but even though I love Nick Cage, detective searching for serial killer is just not a genre that gets me jumping out of my seat to go run and see it, even though I love Silence of the Lambs. But something quirky and darkly whimsical like The Monkey is way more up my alley, or at least I had hoped it would be. But overall, I just didn't connect with anything in it. Yeah, the kills were creative and so horrifically over the top, blood splattery, gory that they were shocking at first. But then once I realized what I was in for, it was just like watching an adult cartoon with zero stakes. I didn't care about any of the characters. And I felt like there was like stuff missing from the narrative, just like in a basic 101 sense. There was all that setup with the kids, and then there was barely an act 2. Really, there wasn't like a big rising action or anything, a narrative thrust. I actually feel like the movie might have been a little bit more interesting, or at least had a little bit more momentum if they had focused on the other brother, Bill, and his journey to figure out and find the monkey and like pay that weird teen, track it down. There was more direct motivation there. His twin was very passive, and his whole goal was to just like disappear basically. So he just wasn't very interesting, and the movie didn't take any time to really flesh them out beyond their childhood. And you can do that. You can give us backstory and then jump 25 years in the future, but they're different people 25 years in the future, no matter what happened to them in the past. That backstory, trauma, and everything just informs the trajectory that they're on as characters, but doesn't really let us know who they are. But I know that this movie isn't about that. It wasn't meant to be a character piece. It wasn't meant to be deep. It wasn't meant to be, well, I'm really not sure what it was meant to be, honestly, because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to take away from it. I mean, yeah, I guess the monkey could be seen as like family trauma that gets passed down and stuff, but like how many times have we seen something like that as a metaphor in a horror film? So I guess any good slasher movie, it was really just about the kills. And like I said, they were creative and shockingly enjoyable at first, but like I said, once I kind of got the gist of what the point of this movie was, which was to just shock us with bigger and literally more explosive gore, I was prepared for it, and there was nothing else that was like really engaging me with it. I thought the aesthetic was interesting, that it was set in like modern day, and even the first act flashback or setup or whatever, which was in the late 90s, it still all felt very much like this sort of retro 70s aesthetic, which was interesting. But again, I'm not really sure why. All of the choices didn't really have any clear answers to me, and not that like I needed it spoon-fed to me, but I didn't feel like there were really any clues even that were there to imply what the point of any of the things were. And also the characters' interactions were so cartoonishly like wacky and zany and unrealistic and unbelievable. And I know it was supposed to be hyper stylized and everything, from the aesthetics to the dialogue to the violence, but there wasn't like any like reason or consistency to any of it that I could ascertain. The way that people talk to each other, all these like weird non sequiturs, and how like just over the top mean and cruel the brother was to his slightly younger twin brother, which I can totally relate to, because technically my twin brother, who you've heard many times on my various podcasts, is technically like a minute older than me. So I call him my big brother sometimes, but he was never horrible to me like that guy. I don't know. It was just never given any context or weight. It was just like, okay, everybody just talks weird. Everybody doesn't act like a person, which made it definitely whimsical and funny in a very awkward, sometimes like cringy way. But I was more laughing out of just like confusion and discomfort than actually being authentically like amused, or that I found anything actually like clever or humorous. there was just a lot of, what is this? What is going on? Why? The second season of Wednesday, which I gave my thoughts about the first season in the previous episode, back when it first premiered, and I really enjoyed it. I recognize it as more Tim Burton comfort food, but it did feel like a return to form that was welcome, especially because he is one of those directors that I did grow up with and that inspired me early on, and then when I was in film school, and a lot of my friends. And I thought that season 2 upheld that same expectation that I had for Tim Burton at his more or less peak with his aesthetics and tone. It really did walk that fine line between being more broadly humorous and comedic, leaning towards a more dark, sometimes even kind of a black comedy. And its lighthearted, sometimes a little sappy teen drama was nicely balanced out with some pretty relatively, but either way, welcome, shocking gore, a lot of which was practical. Just like season 1, I really did enjoy the self-contained nature of the characterizations, how everybody was really amped up and dialed up and over the top. It wasn't realistic, but it wasn't meant to be. Tim Burton, I think, does his best when he's telling more fairy tale stuff than more grounded things. But even though there was a lot of great aesthetics, prosthetics, sets, costumes, there was also a lot of really noticeable immersion-breaking CGI, like Christopher Lloyd. I don't get why they did an obvious mocap, why they couldn't have just used the actor's head and then digitally put in the bubble around him and stuff. It's always nice to see him in things, but that was just so unfinished. And there were some other creatures too, like the wolf, that were just really obviously CGI. But I get budget restrictions and things, even though it does seem like they had a pretty massive budget for this in general. My biggest takeaway from the season, though, was exactly what I felt was lacking from the first season, which was having the whole Addams family interact. Wednesday is a great character, but without her family that are all written to be great foils for her in a lot of different ways, we don't really get to see those dynamics at play, because she thinks that she's like an alpha that's always in control of things, but her family she can't control, and that makes really good drama and tension, but also comedy. So I was really glad that they opened that up and explored those other characters more fully in this season. I also really liked how they expanded the Addams Family lore. I'm sure there are purists out there that feel differently, and I totally understand, because I'm like that about a lot of things, like Star Wars, where I want it to be the way that it was or the way that it's supposed to be. Aliens, Terminator. I hate it when they like retcon things and they make different takes of stuff that's supposed to be a certain way. Like the black goo in Prometheus was just so obnoxious. Or expanding on Michael Myers as a character. My point is that I don't have a deep love or even recognition of the original lore of the Addams Family and what it's supposed to be. So I don't have like specific expectations other than generally like who the characters are. My introduction, like a lot of kids in the 90s, was the Raul Julia movies, and I didn't love them back then anyway, and I haven't really revisited them since. So I'm sure some people would feel it's like making the Joker kill Bruce Wayne's parents in Tim Burton's Batman. It seems like Tim Burton is not afraid to be the one to make major lore changes with things. But for me, I thought it was kind of cool that Thing, for instance, was tied to the Addams Family specifically, and because of things that they had done, secrets and skeletons in their closet from the past, that was kind of fun. But again, I'm sure just like some people are tired of everything in Star Wars having to be related to the Skywalker family, maybe that was too much of a closed loop for some people, and I totally understand that. But especially since Wednesday is its own kind of self-contained take on the Addams Family, I was fine with them going their own way with it. Other than some of the noticeable CGI, though, my biggest issue with the season was how inconsistent it was, especially compared to the first, and that's in the writing and the directing. The camp episode where there's this random group of militant scouts that they're battling against, and Wednesday's ziplining and things, the tone of that was so out of character for the rest of the show. It was so stupid and silly, but not like in a clever or interesting way. I just felt kind of lazy and tacked on. I wonder if actually that was a tacked on episode maybe later down the pike or something, when Netflix was like, oh, we wanted this many episodes, and Tim Burton was like, well, I only had this many ready or whatever. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a case like that. But there were a couple episodes too, and I always made sure to see if they were directed by Burton or not. And you could definitely tell if they were directed by Burton or not. Not to say that everything Burton did was perfect and peak and immaculate, but I feel like from both of these seasons, the stuff that he did direct was the best, most solid, most consistent. And then when they brought in other directors, things kind of fell apart a little bit. Luckily, that one episode didn't ruin the rest of the season, but I thought it did really stick out like a sore thumb. And if and when I ever go back and watch this show, I may skip that one in particular. The other thing that stood out to me just about the pacing of the show, in universe wise, not like the scene to scene pacing, was that I didn't realize that this was taking place over like a whole school year. Like, we rarely saw the kids in class or deal with school at all. And I just got no sense of how much time was passing. So when they said that the school year was wrapping up and everybody was getting ready to go on summer vacation, I thought they were still like in the first few weeks of school. That was just a little jarring. But otherwise, I really like how most of the characters are not superfluous. And like the Hyde, for instance, I thought he was just going to be a throwaway villain from the first one, but they expanded on his character and wove him back into the plot in an interesting way. So I'm really looking forward to season 3, because I don't feel that the show has been super repetitive. It's been moving forward, plot and character-wise, and I think it's generally pretty well done in that regard. So hopefully it won't be like another 3 years before the next season, and all these kids that are supposed to still be in high school look like they're in their 30s, like Stranger Things. Sorry if there's a little extra background noise. My 3D printer is running right above me. So even though I had no plans or intentions on seeing it, for my son's birthday, he wanted to see Conjuring: The Last Rites. So how could I say no? And I had seen all the mainline Conjuring movies up to this one. Plus, I think the first couple Annabelle, especially because Annabelle Creation was getting good reviews after it came out. But I only ever saw the first Conjuring years after it came out, and only because it got so much hype. And people kept telling me how scary it was, and I had to watch it. And when I finally did, I understand why people like haunted house kind of stuff, and I do on occasion. Like, I thought House on Haunted Hill on Netflix was really good, but that was more because of how well it was constructed and how compelling the characters were. All the spooky wandering around and glancing in dark corners until a loud sound and something jumps out at you kind of tropes are usually not enough to keep me engaged in an otherwise pretty boring, predictable, cliche, uninspired, uncreative genre. And I thought the original Conjuring was like fine, but I really don't understand why it is heralded as like one of the best of its kind, because I think it does all the spooky, creepy, and jump scare stuff just fine. But when it comes down to at least what really draws me into movies and storytelling in general is the story and the characters. I thought there were like little inklings and moments of something interesting going on, but the original started out with this huge family that hardly gets developed, and then you introduce the Warrens and then their whole crew, and there was just like this menagerie of characters, and I wasn't sure who I was really supposed to be rooting for, to care about. Barely anybody has any kind of dimension past just being there. And yeah, I just thought it was kind of a pretty standard haunted house movie with a kind of rushed and lackluster climax. So I was pleasantly surprised when the second one tightened things up, had a much smaller cast, and had a much more personal and emotionally driven story. And it turned things on its head a little bit of a genre subversion, where the ghosts were kind of sixth sensing it. What they thought was haunting them was really trying to help them against a bigger evil. So that one actually turned out to be my favorite. And then when the third one came out, and we watched it on whatever it came out on, HBO, it was just more of the same. It was fine. It had good atmosphere, but I just didn't really care about anything that was going on or the characters. And it was really just kind of predictable. And after hearing about all the extended universe movies like The Nun, La Llorona, and further Annabelle movies and everything, and how it sounded just like more of the same, they were just churning these things out, mostly banking on low budget and name recognition to make a profit, I just had no interest. But of all the Conjuring movies that I've seen so far, The Last Rites I thought was by far the most boring for all the reasons that I just listed about why I didn't think the first one was that great. And so much of the movie was taken up with this family drama situation that barely had any relevance or payoff in the end. And one thing I noticed about the climax of pretty much all of these movies, especially when they involve the Warrens, is that it's the same kind of thing and the same nebulous, metaphysical, supernatural rules going into it. And you have the husband just kind of like the steadfast rock supporting his very sometimes strong-spirited but inconsistently abled when it comes to detecting and thwarting demons. And it's kind of like, I don't know, Superman flying faster or something. There's really no way to explain how she just kind of overcomes things in the end. So she just kind of scrunches up her face and tries harder and has more resolve, and then everything's okay. And I do appreciate horror movies that end on a positive note, but I've also found that to be very rote and predictable about this series of films in general, is that each one is pretty self-contained, and it kind of ends like, all right, you know, they lived happily ever after, which is fine, but then it comes back to another chapter where it's supposed to be like their worst case yet or their scariest case yet or whatever, but there's no stakes because, you know, especially after like the third movie where it goes through the same formula where they overcome some great evil and then everybody's happy and smiling at the end, that they're not in any real danger, regardless of the fact that these are somewhat inspired by true stories, just in the context of the world itself. Now, I could see a version of this last movie that actually doesn't have the supernatural crap going on and is about the Warrens dealing with getting older and their daughter becoming an independent adult. Because in this one, at least, the dad had a bit of an arc where he was an untrusting curmudgeon until he finally decides to overcome his doubt and persnicketyness and accept the growth of his family via his son-in-law and not put a damper on his daughter's happiness. I didn't think that that part of the movie was bad. To me, it was actually more compelling than the other stuff, which was, again, just really low stakes. I mean, it took things to a little bit more of extreme than the other movies have, like when the girl was barfing up glass and she's like projectile vomiting blood all over her family in the kitchen. That was really intense. But then the next time we see her, she's fine. And I'm like, so what? And all these movies do that, though. That is very much a trope where ghosts jump out and scare you, or they hurt you a little bit, and then they retreat and wait for their next opportunity or whatever, and you're just like, okay, you know, why is there a whole hour and a half, 2 hours of this when they could just, if they really wanted to, murder their victims and the movie would be 5 minutes long? I know I'm overthinking this, and I know I'm spending more time on this than I probably should, but since I've never talked about these movies at all before on here, I just wanted to give my holistic response to the series and the genre, not just this movie. I know The Conjuring Last Rites made a lot of money, one of the top grossing horror movies ever, but that does not speak to its quality. And just like with the Avatar series or something, success at the box office does not equal good art and timeless longevity for quality stories. I'd like to hope that regardless of where they are released and how they're found and when they're found and find their audience, that good stories will bubble up to the top and last and find their audience eventually. Because honestly, I don't feel like there's any chance that anybody's going to be bringing up Conjuring the Last Rites anytime in the near or far-flung future. The next thing I saw of note in the theaters was the Taylor Swift Life of a Showgirl lyric video, behind-the-scenes music video release movie, whatever the heck that was. And just like when I saw her in concert, which you can hear more about my experience with that and just general context and my history with Taylor Swift, how I used to be a big fan and then fell off as she got more pop on episode 29 of the Moviecast side of this podcast. Like that show, I went to this because of my daughter, but I'm not saying that like as an excuse or anything. I just like going to movies and talking about them, so I make no apologies for the things that I do to support my kids, and I try to enjoy them, even if it's not something that I would have done on my own. And as I was sitting there watching this, I was blown away by how smart this was on a business side. And I've heard over the years that Taylor is a very savvy businesswoman, and if you just look at the trajectory of her career and how she hypes her releases and all the lore and the fandom that she creates and inspires, she and her team really seem to know exactly what they're doing and how to get maximum profit out of it, because this was one of the most cheaply made things I've ever seen. There was, I think, 2 actual music videos, if I'm not mistaken, of very high production value. I mean, they obviously weren't cheap to produce, but a lot cheaper than creating a full-length film. But other than that, everything was just recycled footage that they literally just played in a loop and put like different kaleidoscope effects on, and were otherwise lyric videos as they played through the album, which must have cost next to nothing. All they needed was to like film her walking around in different costumes for a day and then hire an editor to put some effects on it. Really smart, I thought. That was what stuck out to me the most about it. The music, I have not found Taylor Swift's music to be interesting, particularly creative, compelling. Anything that draws me to music can't hold a candle to anything that she put out for her first 3 albums, especially Fearless and Speak Now. I have also done a podcast called Unexpected Masterpieces. That's episode 30 of my Moviecast. And I think it's just a phenomenal album, and it showed the potential of all the right pieces being put together. She can make excellent pop art when she wants to. This whole kind of lo-fi thing she's been doing, at least when she went big pop, it was not my favorite kind of music, but it was at least compelling. It had some energy to it, some life, some soul. Even when it was really kind of obviously fabricated character in her Reputation days, where she was trying to be like the bad girl and she had this bad reputation, at least it had some attitude and some swagger. But really, since that time, it has been so lo-fi and dull. I really am hopeful that she'll make what I consider good listenable music again. But just the fact that I was a fan of her at one point does keep me curious about what she does and keeps me kind of peripherally watching her career. But I thought this was a really smart way to do a record release to get some hype. And I knew it was going to make money no matter what, but the low production value just of this movie, if you can call it that by itself, I thought was just like really savvy and clever. But the thing that I actually found the most compelling about it, though, was all the behind the scenes stuff. I didn't feel like she was particularly interesting or articulate in her interviews, but just the behind the scenes process, watching her both like act and perform, but also direct and give creative insight into the process. I find that stuff really interesting, and I do think she is, on some level or another, an artist, and I am interested to see if she will eventually transition into other areas. Like there was a YouTuber, Patrick H. Willems, did a whole video about how she might be our next up-and-coming director to look out for, because she does direct some of her videos and has a lot of creative input in that area of things. And she's not just a singer, performer, songwriter, but she is also a visual storyteller and seems to understand the language of that. And I'm just curious to see what she does with it. Next up is Good Boy. We happened to catch this at the tail end of its run in theaters. My son was interested, and so is my wife. We're all big dog fans, and we heard that this was an interesting take on that. And I heard generally pretty good reviews of it, so I was confident that it wouldn't be a total waste of time. And I think it's safe to say that none of us were disappointed. I think the horror elements were a little overhyped in some of the marketing, how people were saying that it was basically like a haunted house movie, but from the dog's point of view. I feel like it was more of an atmospheric character drama from the dog's point of view. I didn't find it particularly creepy, definitely not scary, but it was very chilling in that if you know anything about dogs and people's relationships with them, which most of us do, that dogs have a sense about people beyond what we have with each other. That's why you have dogs not just to help with people's physical and emotional support, but also illnesses like diabetes, blood sugar detecting dogs. And knowing all that and getting a pretty clear picture right off the bat of what the real issue was that the human was dealing with in this movie, which was some kind of chronic or terminal illness, coupled with the understanding of how dogs, especially those that are loyal to their owners, can be very connected to their pain and their strife, along with their joy and happiness. We know that dogs, amongst other animals, are very emotional and emotionally bonded. And that's what I found more kind of chilling and tense about it, was that poor dog and our empathetic journey with them as they experienced something that we know was not only really hard and painful for their owner, but being from the point of view of the dog, in some ways really was even more heart-wrenching and challenging to watch because we know that dogs are so sensitive to these kinds of things. So I thought that was really clever. But the movie itself, I thought was well done. I enjoyed it. I don't have any huge reactions or takeaways. I didn't feel very strongly about it one way or another. I just thought it was solid. It was interesting. It was well done. The most interesting part about it to me, though, was the post-credits little documentary that they showed. I'm sure that'll be part of the Blu-ray or something when it comes out. But if you didn't get to see it in the theater, there was this, like, I don't know, maybe 10-minute little behind-the-scenes featurette about how they did it and how creative they had to be about it, how this was actually the director, producer, actor guy's dog, and he and his, I don't know if his wife or his girlfriend, I don't remember, were like pretty much the entire crew during production. And then of course they brought in editors and sound designers and stuff afterwards, but the production crew, they had to keep it small because I think they filmed it over a very long shoot, a lot longer than most shoots. I think it was like a year, maybe longer if I'm not mistaken. So they didn't want to have to keep a cast and crew in their house where they filmed it that whole time, so they just did the two of them and they just got the shots that they needed as they could. And I thought it was just really interesting little insight into how they did it and what their vision was for it. So that's probably on YouTube or something, and if not, like I said, I'm sure it'll be on the Blu-ray when it comes out. But it's worth a watch because it is a very unique way that they went about making this movie. This was not a 2025 release, but I've been hearing about it for so long, and it finally came out on Max or HBO Max, I think it was. And I told my wife, all right, we got to watch this because I've just been hearing so much hype about it. So we finally sat down and watched The Substance. And boy, was it substance full. There's really nothing new that I can say about it. My reactions to it were very similar to what a lot of people said and what I heard beforehand, where I thought the first half or 2/3 were like really, really good. I loved the satirical, over-the-top zaniness of it, even though the zaniness was pushed to a very disgusting body horror, violent extreme. But it was still very cartoony, and everything was heightened. The fact that she had that billboard of herself outside of her window, and just touches like that were so funny and also so horrific in their implications. That's just the kind of satire that I eat up and always come back for more. But like a lot of people, and I know that some people love it and some people hated it, but I was kind of ambivalent about the ending. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I had heard that the ending goes really big. My issue with it wasn't that it went there, but that it happened so fast that I really didn't feel like it was properly set up and built up to, because so much of the movie, Demi Moore's character was spent in isolation, especially her older self, but even a lot of times with her younger self. And so other than Dennis Quaid, who flitted in and out of the movie, and I thought he played that role like impeccably, for her to go in front of a big audience and put it all on the line like that, I just didn't feel like it was quite there story-wise. I didn't feel like it truly paid off the more bleak and somber quietness that the rest of the movie had. When people were talking about Demi's performance in this and how it was like a career-defining performance and that she was up for Best Actress at several different award shows and things, I was actually kind of surprised that a lot of the movie she didn't talk, or she had minimal dialogue. So much of it was just in her eyes and her expression, and I really did find that compelling and really, really top-notch from her. I mean, I've always thought she was a great actress, but this was really, really compelling until the last third or so. And it wasn't even the horribly grotesque body horror of what happens. It was really just her like throwing herself into public, hoping for acceptance. That could have been something, but like I said, it just didn't quite have the foundation laid, I don't think, to be the proper payoff to what came before. So it was a little bit of a deflation. I was hoping that this would be up there with one of the satires that I talk about on my satire episode of this podcast, which was episode 27, but I don't think it quite hit the mark. But speaking of the gore, and especially that ending, I really, really did appreciate all throughout the movie, but especially the end, the very clearly bold statement they were making about practical effects, because they could have easily done all that with CGI, and I'm sure a lot of it was enhanced, but it felt a lot more in line with something like The Thing, of course, Toxic Avenger, the mutant guy in RoboCop after he gets hit with the toxic waste. And thematically, I could see what they were going for. The tragedy of it, very in line with something like Frankenstein, Golem, Carrie kind of idea. And I'm not saying that it didn't affect me or that I didn't find it absolutely vomit-inducing disgusting, but it wasn't as shocking as I was expecting, just based on the hype that I've heard around how incredibly horrifically shocking the end of the movie was for a lot of people. Because I do feel like I've seen, at least in terms of the effects, not that exactly before, but things like it. And it's interesting because I was just reading a Giles-centered Buffy the Vampire Slayer comic because I'm catching up on all the Buffy media that I can, so I can talk about the Buffyverse for a hopefully soon upcoming episode on this podcast, because my brother made me do it. But in that comic that I was just reading today, not intentionally, had very similar imagery from both Demi Moore's transformation at the end of The Substance and The Thing, like big tentacled, multi-mouth, multi-eyeballed, grotesque, gooey, mucusy grossness. And just like I wouldn't be surprised if this Buffy comic was largely inspired by The Thing, especially because one of the creatures in it has a mouth down its big bulbous stomach that eats people. But I also wouldn't be surprised if obviously The Thing and maybe even this comic inspired some of the imagery at the end of The Substance. Who knows? But apart from the visuals, or going along with the visuals, the other part that I found incredibly impactful and horribly disgusting was the sound design. There was so much oozing and squelching and squishing and it was like anti-ASMR. And at this point, we are well into spooky October Halloween season, so my wife and I went back and watched a couple things that either she or I hadn't seen before. One of them was from way back, Robert Zemeckis' Death Becomes Her. I never saw it. I remember as a kid seeing the video box, the VHS box in Blockbuster as a kid, and of course I wasn't allowed to see it back then. But I was always really curious about it. It looked interesting and whimsical and scary. And I totally forgot that it was a Zemeckis movie, but I loved it. I'm really sad that I had never seen it until now, but I'm glad I got to watch it with my wife because she's great company for this kind of stuff. And it was a perfect follow-up to The Substance because it dealt with a lot of similar thematic kind of stuff. The essence of beauty and what fame can do, not just to affect somebody's external view of the world, but their internal view and who they are as a person. My favorite part about it, though, was Bruce Willis. He was playing against type, at least post-Die Hard type, so wonderfully. He was so goofy. I thought he was fantastic. We've become so accustomed to seeing him as the gruff, no-nonsense action guy, but also, you know, the down-to-earth, tough, everyday man action guy, that playing this, like, insecure nerd, this kind of more corporate dork, was so entertaining. But as I was watching it, I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely Zemeckis, because you could tell how much fun he was having and how much creative effort he put into all those body horror effects, walking around with their heads turned around and a hole through their torso. It was a great black comedy, really macabre, but really silly, very satirical. And as I said a minute ago, I love that kind of stuff when it's done well and it's done right, and I thought this was done pretty awesome. Looking forward to watching it again. So in part one of this 2025 roundup, I talked about seeing the 2025 Nosferatu, but last fall, the most perfect Halloween situation that I could ever conjure in my head, the Poe Museum here in Richmond, Virginia, because this is one of the several places that he lived and worked. I've actually lived in 3 of the places that he lived and worked and spent time in Baltimore and Philly, but I actually didn't go to his gravesite in Baltimore until about a year ago, if I remember correctly. It was a fairy solstice celebration at the church that he's buried at in Baltimore. And even though I lived in Philly for the 4 years that I went to college there, I never went to the Poe Museum in Philly, and I'm really upset with myself about that. I don't know how that could be, because I was a big, Tim Burton fan at the time. I loved and have always loved macabre dark Halloween stuff. And I was also a writing major, and I was reading stuff along those lines. I don't know what was wrong with me. Someday I have to go visit Philly again and make up for that. But luckily, the Poe Museum here in downtown Richmond was showing the original 20s silent film version of Nosferatu, Under the Stars. And it turned out to actually be a really lovely evening. It was not like warm, but it was not cold. We bundled up, and then we were sitting there shedding layers, and they just had folding chairs out on their little courtyard. If you've never been, look up pictures. It is a adorable little like garden courtyard that they have, and then they have a gift shop, and they have a place where you can see like original versions of his work, and they have all this other stuff related to Poe. It's a really cool spot. People do weddings there and events and stuff, but you could bring a blanket. Some people brought their own folding chairs, and they otherwise just had folding chairs out, and they had popcorn and candy, and they had one of those big inflatable screens, and they were playing, I don't know, it was like a DVD or like a ripped file, and they were having trouble, of course, connecting the HDMI to the projector, and they had to deal with some technical difficulties at the beginning, but they finally got it going. I'm pretty sure we watched the original version of Nosferatu in my freshman year at film school, where we had a 2-semester part 1 part 2 history of narrative cinema class or something like that, and it was like a 3-hour seminar class where we would watch a movie and then we discuss it and we write papers about it and analyze them and stuff. And during the first part of the first semester, where it was all silent film stuff, where we watched, you know, like Birth of a Nation and the train coming into the station and Battleship Potemkin, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is that right? All those old classics. Nosferatu was included in that, but that was more than 20 years ago, so it was really cool revisiting this, especially after having seen Robert Eggers' remake several months back. It was really fun to have that fresh in my mind and compare and contrast. And watching Robert Eggers' version back last winter, I didn't realize how much of sometimes a shot-for-shot remake it was, just more in his style. But there is just so much to love and appreciate and absorb and get inspired by from film from that era. Because even though I don't want to come across like a snob or an elitist or something, because I don't fashion myself like that. Yeah, I went to film school, but I'm just a average guy that likes movies, and I was able to get loans, not pay out of pocket, to go to film school. I'm not a film like snob or some like high-minded film critic or something. I just love movies and TV and stories, but yet there was a lot of laughter from the small audience that was there watching the movie, a couple dozen people maybe, and there was different generations, probably a smattering of millennials, Gen Zers, maybe even Gen Xers, and out of context, yes, there's like a lot of silly moments, the overacting, some of the wonky editing, the title cards. I totally understand. I grinned at a few things. There was some obvious, you know, like mistakes or issues that they were having with effects or something like that. But people were laughing kind of a lot, and I was trying really hard to go along with it and just be like, you know, everybody has their own experience, and objectively, a lot of this stuff is kind of funny. But for one part, this was close to Halloween, and we were outside under the moon and the stars in the Poe Museum, and it was very atmospheric, and I was just trying to be in that more, this is so fun and spooky state. But I felt like some people were treating it like we were watching a comedy. So I wasn't trying to be like offended or insulted or something, but a few times I wanted to be like, hey, could you like shut up? Because this is supposed to be scary. And for people that were watching this 100 years ago, it was. So, you know, maybe we could try to like give it that respect and reverence instead of just like, oh, this is 2025 funny. Because, you know, not everything has to be ironic. All right, now I'm like becoming a boomer curmudgeon, so I'll stop. But it was a really, really great time. I forgot how much stop motion there was in this version just to make things that a person couldn't do without enhancement. Like when Count Orlok rises up out of his coffin, seemingly kind of floating or flying. Really clever workarounds for that kind of stuff. But I love the use of shadow and how ominous that was. And I thought Eggers took that and ran with it in interesting, creative ways. There were a lot of really interestingly and creepily composed shots, things in the background and the foreground going on. There was a lot of cinematic mastery, even in those early days. People that just understood the visual language of film. It's so cool to think how they had such an open sandbox back then, and the audiences weren't as desensitized and learned and expectant of things. So I'm sure the movie had even more of an impact in that regard because there were very few things like it at that point. And otherwise, just all the mise en scène, just to totally fly in the face of not being a film snob. That's one of those terms, you learn in film school, or if you read a book about movies. The sets, the hair and makeup, the costumes, really top notch. You can tell that it was a pretty big production for the time. And then after we saw the movie, we went to the Guar Bar, which is just a little dive bar in, I want to say Jackson Ward. I don't know the Richmond areas as well as I probably should, but I'm not a Richmonder. I'm a transplant. But that's where we went for dinner after. And if you don't know anything about Guar, they're a punk metal band and art collective from Richmond, Virginia. And they have their own dive bar where you can get food and drinks, and they're all named cheeky, gross, macabre kind of things. And they have paraphernalia and stuff from their extravagant, disgusting, costume-laden live shows, different creatures and imagery and stuff. So it's a fun place to hang out, especially right after seeing Nosferatu, especially a week or two before Halloween. Continuing with the spooky season, catching up on stuff from years past. I think this was like a year old. Heretic was also on streaming, I think again on HBO. I guess I got my money's worth out of them, at least for this month. But I had heard good things about it, especially about Hugh Grant's performance. I heard that it was going to be very talky and a little brainy, which I know isn't for everyone. And for me, it just really depends. 'Cause I do like dialogue-heavy stuff. I love Aaron Sorkin and Tarantino, Kevin Smith. But that's when the dialogue is really well done, and it's done for a purpose. It's not just in place of visual storytelling, because I do think that a lot of directors and producers forget the golden rule, to me at least. What should be the golden rule of visual media is the visual part, that it should start with showing and explaining through visuals and all the different parts of that language that are available before we go straight to dialogue. To me, dialogue should be an enhancement and cover ground that the visuals can't. But like with this latest season of Stranger Things is a perfect example, and don't worry, we'll get to that. Dialogue can be a big crutch and a pace killer and a snooze fest. So I understand why some people would be turned off by that, especially in a horror movie or a thriller. But I had a feeling that it was going to be purposeful, and I wasn't wrong. I really did enjoy the movie. The subject matter has I don't know if special place in my heart is the right term, but I was brought up in a religious household, and I started questioning that stuff from a really early age, and I got met with a lot of pushback. So I'm always curious to see how people handle that kind of stuff and their takes on answering some of these big questions. So I did find Hugh Grant and his quest to be really interesting. I thought the movie was really tense. I thought the dialogue was well constructed and really, really well acted on Hugh Grant's part. He was such a smarmy, whatever that word is, pompous, arrogant, blowhard, obviously putting on the guise of being humble and charming, which I think Hugh Grant was an absolutely inspired choice for that role, because he is all those things, at least typecast as a actor. So to be somebody having to act that way, to put on that persona to lure in his prey, I thought was a really kind of cool subversion for him, because it wasn't the core of his character. It was all the show. Where things fell apart to me, though, was the end, which happens in a lot of these movies, where they have a great premise and they have a great setup and initial execution and rising action, but then they just don't know how to end. Don't Breathe was another perfect example of that to me. What a great, tense movie until the last act, which it all just kind of gets super silly and stupid. This, I don't feel like anything that happened at the end broke the movie, but I did find the end the least interesting part, when we learn how it's all been a lie, and that's the point. I thought the point was well made. It was hammered home pretty well, that the only true religion is power and control and stuff like that. But once you show and explain every little thing about how something like this could work, there's just so many questions and so many logic holes and so many plausibility issues that you start overanalyzing it even when you don't want to. And people say, like, just turn your brain off and stuff. And you can do that in stories where they don't invite you to ask the kind of questions of like, okay, so how does this work? Oh, it works like that? Well, then what about this? And what about that? I feel like very similarly to that I felt with both Nope and Us from Jordan Peele, that this movie would have really benefited from some ambiguity. I think it would have been interesting for not only the characters, but for the audience to be left in the dark about whether or not Hugh Grant really had a prophet in his clutches, if miracles maybe were possible, even though maybe there would be some evidence to debunk where he's purporting, but plausible deniability as well. But unfortunately, I don't know if it was the writers or the producers just get cold feet about these things and they feel like audiences aren't going to get it if you don't explain every little thing. I know it's a really tough thing. It's a fine line to walk between coming across like you had a good premise, but you really don't have it all fleshed out and you don't have the answers. And that's why it's left ambiguous, to just over-explaining and spilling all the beans to the point that it kind of ruins the whole thing. This was in the middle for me. I didn't think it was a total loss. I really did enjoy the movie a lot. But overall, I just wasn't as impacted by it. And I don't think I'm going to be interested to revisit it anytime soon because of that. Another movie from a year or two ago that I think was also on HBO Max, probably recommended to me because I watched Heretic, was Talk to Me. I remember hearing great things about this. I've heard it brought up recently, especially because I know that the filmmaking team made another one this year. What was it called? Bring Her Back. And I was curious to see that, but I did want to see Talk to Me first to kind of decide where I was in terms of seeing Bring Her Back in the theaters or just waiting for streaming or seeing it at all. And I think I can sum up how I felt about Talk to Me by saying that I don't have any interest in seeing Bring Her Back now that I've seen Talk to Me. And that's just because I think I was way overhyped. And I know that, I shouldn't listen to all the hype. I shouldn't read reviews and listen to reviews and all that kind of stuff. But as I constantly say on here, and I will continue to, between my professional life and my family life, I don't have a lot of time to indulge in these things and take big swings at, hey, I'm randomly going to watch this thing tonight. Because, with the little time that I do have after the day is done and I have some time to sit down with my wife and relax, first of all, we have to agree on something that we want to watch together. And whether it's streaming or going to the movies, it's my hard-earned money that I'm putting on the line, so I don't want it to feel like a waste of time. So even though I know that reviews are essentially people's opinions and they're very subjective and shouldn't be taken as like cold hard truth, it does help me to get a variety of different people's takes on stuff before I see it, usually, unless it's something I know for sure that I'm going to go see no matter what beforehand. And that's just the reality that I live in. But in this case, people were talking about Talk to Me, and the reason that I was so interested in seeing it from the time that it came out until I finally saw it is people were talking about it like it was this really unique, original thing. I knew it was going to be dark. I knew it was going to be bleak. That's fine as long as it's interesting and creative and has a unique take on things, on the genre, on the characters, something. And though I thought the characters in Talk to Me were generally more fleshed out and compelling than in a lot of horror movies, like the Conjuring universe stuff, for instance, I still found a lot of the kind of teen tropes to be pretty played out, especially because there just wasn't a lot of dynamicism in the performances. I thought the performances were pretty good, but everybody was either only depressed or only a jerk or only sus or only ambivalent or whatever it was. They were kind of like one-note characters. So I just wasn't really that engaged with it. I thought the premise was interesting, but really nothing new or original. People unlocking some kind of supernatural thing that they think is funny or fun or a joke or whatever, but then it turns out they've unlocked Pandora's box and can't close it and comes back to bite them, haunts them. So most of the movie, I was kind of like waiting for the movie to really start. Like, what is this unique take? What is this twist? And then at the end, which I think is what got a lot of people, it really just didn't hit me that hard or really at all. Actually, I really didn't like it that much, coming to think of it. Honestly, not to be like pretentious or anything, but I really saw that twist coming from a mile away. Because that's like kind of the way to do a tragedy, is make your characters have to face or become the one thing that they've been running from or the thing that they swear they're never going to be or whatever. And yeah, it dealt with trauma, intergenerational trauma, all that kind of stuff. But I don't know. I don't know why we herald that in this day and age as being like this interesting take on the horror genre, because it's been doing that for decades. People said a lot of the same stuff about Smile, so I watched Smile because of that, and when I saw it, I was like, this is so, I don't know, pedestrian. This thing is obviously a manifestation of this girl's trauma, and she had to overcome it, but then she doesn't, so it's a tragedy. And this movie was the same kind of thing, where I felt like there was no balance. There was nothing to hope for. I knew that regardless of the reviews and everything, which I didn't have spoiled for me, I didn't know exactly how it was going to end, but I could just tell that this wasn't going to have a happy ending. It showed you from the first scene that it was going to be a pretty bleak movie and story, but I didn't feel like it really amounted to anything. It didn't mean anything. It didn't have that, like, irony, I thought, to the tragedy, like Shakespeare was so good at or whatever, where it didn't have to be this way. And it said something about the choices that the people made along the way and the kind of people that they were, the kind of people they could have been had they only just made slightly different choices or had a different perspective. I kind of felt like this was all pretty inevitable and everything was so messed up. I don't know. I didn't enjoy it. It left a bad taste in my mouth. I didn't get anything out of it. I just think that it wasn't for me. So I did a YouTube short on Murders in the Building. I think it was during its second season, and it had this cool redemptive moment for a character that I wanted to highlight. But I haven't really talked about it in general on any of my output. So just a quick overview. I started watching it from the beginning just because, probably like a lot of people, I'm a big Steve Martin fan and Martin Short, and I knew who Selena Gomez was, but I wouldn't really say that I was like a fan of hers. I didn't really know her as an actress from much. I didn't have Disney Channel growing up. Not that I was like depraved or anything. I just haven't had cable much as an adult because I had DVDs and then streaming. And as I've said many times on here as well, I'm not a big murder mystery or true crime seeker-outer, but if it's done well, I will give it a chance. And there are things I have enjoyed in that genre for sure. But because I knew this was going to be more quirky because of the talent involved, that's more what I was looking forward to. And it definitely didn't let me down in that department. What I was more surprised and compelled by, though, was especially the first season had a lot of really interesting visual language, and it went places that I didn't expect, like the reoccurring motif of Martin Short falling up and down the stairs as like a visual metaphor for what he was experiencing in his life and stuff like that. I didn't realize there would be such, not mind-blowingly subtle and intellectual, but definitely there was some artistry and interesting curveballs thrown into this show that I wasn't expecting. I just assumed it'd be more straightforward. And the characters are so likable. The mysteries are interesting. My wife and I have stuck with the show since it started. But for a few seasons in the middle there, I did feel like it has been kind of spinning its wheels. It's been a bit unfocused, especially since the first season. And that's just an issue I think that I have with mysteries a lot of times, is there's so many red herrings and misdirects, which I know is part of the genre, part of the storytelling, part of the fun for a lot of people. When things focus in one area, you have to ignore other areas to give that other thing time. And then when that thing turns out to not be actually important, or like a red herring or a misdirect, then I'm left with that, like, kind of, well, that felt like a waste of time. Why are we focused on things that don't actually matter for this plot or story? But in general, I think Murders does a pretty good job of bringing all that stuff back together, all their loose ends and various pieces that they set up. Though I do feel like they lose focus sometimes on the main thrust of things. They go off on tangents and side quests, and sometimes that slows the tension down. But overall, I have enjoyed the show. Though I do feel like this past season was the most focused and the least wheel spinny since the first season. So it's cool to see that even after 5 seasons, they can bring it home and it doesn't feel like it's just totally run out of steam or anything. I really didn't think, especially with a few of the actors' ages and stuff, I just assumed that this would be like a one-off kind of thing, or maybe just a couple seasons if it was popular. But it seems like they're just going to keep it going for as long as, I don't know, Hulu is going away apparently. As long as it keeps getting watched on whatever platform, it ends up on Disney Plus. But I also thought that this past season had the most character growth since its earlier days, and that is really what keeps me coming back for TV. If the characters aren't moving forward, then I often tend to lose interest in that status quo, and that's why I do gravitate back to movies most of the time before I really want to settle down and dig into a show. But this one's short and sweet. It usually gets to the point pretty quickly, and it's also not 3 years in between seasons, which is nice. Take note, Stranger Things and Wednesday. So yeah, I'm looking forward to season 6.
And beyond!
So as you can hear on episode 21 of this podcast, where my brother and I talk about our history with anime in general, but also episode 30, where we talk specifically about his favorite anime in recent years, and one that I did enjoy, Attack on Titan. Anime's been a big part of my media consumption since I was younger, and has lessened over the years, mostly just like with comic books, because of the sheer quantity. I just can't keep up with it. But I do have a special place in my heart for the art form and animation style and a lot of the cultural mores that come with it. But these days, my biggest exposure to anime is my son, which should be of no surprise. I thought anime was huge when I was a teenager, when I was my son's age, which is it's crazy to think. But now that he's in his mid-teens in 2025, it seems like anime is bigger than ever, and that makes sense, especially with the access to it, with things like Crunchyroll and the fact that it's all over Netflix and Hulu, and HBO Max has the Studio Ghibli library and all that stuff. I think it's so great that kids and younger generations have so much access to it, and I'm jealous because I never would have done anything else if I had that much access to it. And sometimes I wonder where my son has a chance to like play video games and make friends when he's watching so much anime. I remember he told me that he watched like 600 episodes of One Piece throughout a couple months or something a year or two ago. I don't know. And I was like, when? That is so much TV. But I think what they do when it comes to stuff like that, probably like Dragon Ball Z and stuff, is they do those like YouTube catch-ups and overviews, and they don't watch like all the filler, and they just stick with the main plot stuff. I don't know. Could be wrong. They might watch all of it. But he's gotten into so many things, and he wants me to watch all of it, and I never have the time. We did try to watch Demon Slayer together as a family when my boys were a little bit younger, when they were in their tweens, and you can hear my thoughts on that on the anime episode on this podcast. But I've come to discover that I am not the biggest shonen style fan, especially when it comes to storytelling. The animation is fine, and the style is fine, but when you have like one battle lasting like several episodes, and most of it is just like an internal monologue of all the different things that the character is worried about or preparing to do, I'm like, just do it. Just do the thing. Shut up in your head and just do it.
Just do it!
But regardless of how I feel about all these things in general, like I was saying about my daughter and Taylor Swift, if my son says, Dad, I want to see anime in a theater, of course I'm going to take him, because I love anime in general. I want to support it, and I also want to support theaters because I love movies and I love theater going, and it looks like that's not going to be around for too much longer, at least not in its current form. So I had heard about Chainsaw Man as one of the many modern animes that kids are into, like Demon Slayer and One Punch Man, My Hero Academia, which I saw that movie with my son a little bit more than a year-ish ago. And just like seeing that, I have not had the time to catch up on Chainsaw Man, the series, though unlike My Hero Academia, where I had seen zero of its content before I saw the movie, and I was just overwhelmed by the avalanche, the tidal wave of characters and powers and plot stuff and character relationships, and it was like way too much to try to understand and dig through. I just had to kind of go with it. I did watch the first couple episodes of Chainsaw Man before I saw the movie with my son, just to give myself a little bit of context, and my biggest apprehension about it was I thought the design was cool, but I could not figure out how they were going to craft a story around a guy that has a chainsaw coming out of his face and hands. I just had no idea about what kind of world that could exist with that kind of thing being a thing. So it was really helpful to at least get the foundation of the character and the foundation of the way the world works in context of this universe, where things like a chainsaw dog is a thing and that people can merge with those, what do they call them in this universe? Devils? It's either like demons or devils or spirits or yokai. And I did find the main character's plight and desires pretty relatable and very understandable and sympathetic. So even though he was living in this super wacky, crazy world of all these different devils that could manifest these totally bizarre powers, like a chainsaw coming out of your face, though you'd be a really good arborist, come to think of it. Anyway, yeah, I actually liked it more than I expected to, especially having been so annoyed by things like Demon Slayer. I thought it was pretty fresh and creative and had pretty interesting characters, at least from the get-go, and a understandable and compelling plot thrust. I knew the movie was picking up after a bunch of episodes of that season that I hadn't seen yet, so I wasn't surprised going into it that I wasn't familiar with a lot of the subtleties and some main characters that I hadn't been introduced to yet and stuff. But I was impressed that, unlike with a lot of these releases, I know that the idea when they put some of the stuff in theaters is to kind of build hype, not for it to be its own self-contained movie as much, but they'll show like a clip episode or a sum up of what's come before, and then they'll show you the first few episodes of the next season like they've done with Demon Slayer. That's what I was expecting this to be. I was pleasantly surprised that it was its own standalone, self-contained story for the most part, that it was taking place in between seasons, which did make it feel like more of a movie, because it was, and I like that. Made the experience that much more enjoyable. And I was really surprised though, and a little, not bored, but kind of like, oh, is this it? For like the first half of the movie almost was like this teen rom-com. It was pretty standard, it was cute, and it was enjoyable, but I was like, oh, wait, is this just gonna be like mostly this, and then they're just gonna fight devils later? But I thought it was pretty cleverly written, especially for the more uninitiated like me, that the girlfriend character turns out to be the bad guy, which wasn't a huge shocker because she was very overly into this guy from the get-go, and that was a little sus. But I'm a hopeful and hopeless romantic, so I like to give those things a benefit of the doubt and hope for the best, even though it turned out to be the worst. So I actually ended up enjoying that part of the movie a little bit more than the next big chunk, which was like one huge battle, which I know is more exactly what the shonen lovers are there to see. People like my son, they love the animation and the crazy creative takes on all these demons and devils and curses and all that kind of stuff. The overstimulating cavalcade of visuals that are coming at you so fast you cannot process them in the moment at all. So that stuff just kind of washed over me. There was so much happening so fast. Again, I know it makes you sound like a curmudgeonly boomer, but I was like, slow down for a second. Like, I want to be able to actually enjoy what's happening here. There's just like so much being thrown at you. But it all really came together in the end. I thought it was actually a really well-written movie because it went in very distinct acts of action or plot where they had this character setup stuff. Then they had the action, but then they tied it all together with an emotional resonance that I really wasn't expecting, especially from such a emotionally immature character as our lead Chainsaw Man fella. So yeah, that was a surprisingly good time for something that my son was really excited about, but I was more just coasting on his excitement and I was going along for the ride, and I ended up having a really good time. I may go back and watch the rest of the Chainsaw Man season whenever I can find the time. Couple more spooky ones before we move out of October. Another 2025 release, but a little bit late catch-up, was Weapons. I saw Barbarian late too, but like a lot of horror movies that I watch, I don't rush out to see them in theaters because you just never know. But once they get good word of mouth, they have some staying power, I will check them out. And I really did enjoy Barbarian. And even though I guess I was expecting a little bit more high-mindedness maybe to come out of Weapons because of the setup and the potential for how deep they could have gone with this collective trauma and how different people deal with it, which they definitely explored, but not to the level that I thought they were going to, because, and I shouldn't have been surprised having seen Barbarian, but like Barbarian, it went in a totally different direction, very wacky, not as thematically rich, but definitely entertaining, at least to me. I loved how it took its time getting to this point and then just taking this huge, crazy climax. It was one of the like literal get up out of my seat and whoop and holler kind of moments when the ant lady got what was coming to her. My biggest takeaway from this one though was that poor poor kid and how his whole life is going to be defined by this, and he's never going to be able to escape it. I mean, the other kids were put in a trance or whatever, but he was consciously and begrudgingly doing these horrible things because of the leverage that his aunt had over him, and that was just devastating. Even though things worked out in the end, he's going to have a whole lifetime of trauma to unpack. As is becoming an annual tradition in October in my household, my wife and I caught Exorcist just around Halloween, and there's really nothing that I can say about it that hasn't already been said. And my mission statement for this series on my podcast was to not necessarily talk about every single thing that I saw just because, but talk about things that I actually had a reaction to or something to say something about. And so for the umpteenth time watching The Exorcist, which I still uphold as the scariest movie ever made, at least that I've seen grosser movies, and I've seen more gory, and I've seen more psychologically thrilling and disturbing and all that kind of stuff. But there's something about this movie in particular that scares the living daylights out of me. I've never quite been able to pinpoint why this one is so unnerving, and honestly, every year before my wife suggests that we watch it, I'm always a little apprehensive, like, yeah, I've seen it, I don't know if I need to see it anytime soon, but then I still will sit down and watch it because it's so good. But I think I've finally figured out what gets me about this movie in this genre. When I compare it to other movies of its time period, other time periods, but any kind of supernatural, ghost, possession, exorcism, horror, body horror, all the different things that it encompasses. This one, I think, in my opinion, is the least stylized. And that is not to say that it doesn't have style. It doesn't have visual style and language that makes it so classic and timeless in so many ways. But the combination of all the different parts of it, from the cinematography, which is not very snazzy, it doesn't draw attention to itself. A lot of the shots are composed very, I don't want to say is in a pejorative way, but it's basic close-ups and medium shots, tracking shots. There's nothing that really stands out like they're trying to be flashy. It just feels almost like you're there. And not in a documentary kind of way where you're aware of the separation between you and the camera. Like, you feel like you're standing in the room or you are these characters. And that's where the performances come in. They're so raw and they're so gritty and they're so real. This feels like how real people react to this. Sometimes people's reactions are just completely unremarkable because the things that they're going through are so impossible to process. But then when things do get released, like when the mom has her breakdown with Father Dammy on the bench where she's like begging for his help, it's just crushing. And same thing at the very end. He's had his composure for this whole movie, and he finally just unleashes, not on Regan, on the little girl, but on the demon that's been tormenting him and tormenting this family. And he does, unfortunately, like punch a little girl in the face, but it's not directed at her. In general, I think the key word here is grit. It just feels very on the ground. From what I can remember thinking about it right now, there's no like big sweeping crane shots. There's not even a lot of establishing shots that aren't from like street level with a tripod. Most of the camera work is very still. And another word I would use, especially when it comes to the editing, is bluntness. It just ends scenes sometimes like right in the middle of the rising action without resolution. Like, for instance, the first time that the demon / Regan is making things swirl around the room and the mom is trapped in the room because that dresser armoire or whatever it's called, the hutch, blocks the door, and she just starts screaming. In the middle of her scream, it just cuts to, I think, Father Dammy running on the track. And there's so many little moments and transitions like that where it's not exactly like natural, but it's not hyper stylized either. It's hard to explain, but it's got this bluntness where it's almost like taunting the audience, like, oh yeah, you want a resolution? Too bad. Overall, I would say that even with a lot of movies like The Shining, for instance, which is very stylized, very Kubrick, but there's a certain comfort in how depraved and dark it gets. It's still got a very nice look about it. It's shot so artistically with so much intention and implication behind the framing and the staging of the shots and the characters, the depth of frame, the colors. It feels like a movie. It's, very cinematic, and you can easily get immersed in those experiences, and that's why I would still say that's I think the best horror movie ever made. But still, The Exorcist, it just doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like they were worried about how slick it came across and what it was really trying to say. It was just this is a horrible, tragic, disturbing, horrifying experience, and here it is. They just present it to you like that, with no pretense. There's no pretension. There's no pomp and circumstance. It's just real. So yes, I stand by my statement that, like a lot of people, the scariest horror movie ever made. But now I think I have a better idea why, and I'm looking forward to watching it again next Halloween and paying a little bit more attention to these little details. I just think it's a really brilliantly, effectively disturbing movie that movies like The Conjuring, for instance, wishes that it could ever even come close to aspiring to. So after Halloween, spooky season was over, my wife and I were looking for something to watch that we hadn't seen. We're a little adrift on what to watch, and we were scrolling through one of the streamers, and Fried Green Tomatoes popped up, and I mentioned offhand that I'd never seen it, and she was like, "Oh my God, you've never seen it?" So we watched it, and I don't have a ton to say about it. It was definitely a lot different than what I expected, even though I don't know what I expected. It was one of those movies that I remember my parents had seen, or at least it was more directed to their generation growing up in the 90s. So I knew it existed, but I don't know, between the title and the fact that I knew that it took place in the South, I think, based on the cuisine that it's referencing, I don't know, I thought it was just more of a prestige drama or something. So I didn't really know what to expect, but this is definitely not exactly what I expected. It was a lot more irreverent, a lot funnier than I thought it was going to be, but it was also a really good drama. Kathy Bates gave a powerhouse performance as expected, and I haven't followed her career super closely over the years, but everything that I have seen her in, I've been really impressed. And a little while back on episode 19 of this podcast, I talked about catching up with some classic horror movies, one of them being Misery, and she blew me away in that too. But my biggest takeaway from it was how it kind of was what it was. I found it well written and acted and directed and performed and everything, but I did not see that big sort of twist ending coming up, or maybe potential reveal, where they potentially ate that guy, which sort of recontextualized the, at least to me, overall tone and themes of that movie. Because it did seem to be, at least from the main characters and their intentions and motivations, were generally more or less wholesome and productive until we find out the possibility that they disposed of their evidence via really malicious and spiteful cannibalism. That's one of those things where I don't know if I would call this movie a satire necessarily, but if that is not meant to be taken lightheartedly and offhandedly as a bit of a joke or a throwaway, and that's really part of the plot, I know that it's meant to be cheeky and a bit ambiguous.
Are you saying you killed Jimbo, processed his carcass, and served him for lunch?
But I like to imagine realities where alternate, more darker versions of these movies exist, like the conspiracy theories about Willy Wonka or the sociopathic Kevin McAllister in Home Alone, something like that. So in that more unlikely but slightly more sinister and interesting version of that movie, I found that to be a very twistedly satisfying ending for these characters and the implications of what kind of people that they were. So even if the rest of the movie wasn't as overall quality and entertaining and compelling as it was, that ending alone was more than enough to pique my interest and make me want to return to it at some point someday. I'm going to lump these next two in together because I have pretty much the same kind of reaction to them, and they go together in the little mini Eddie Murphy marathon that my wife and I found ourselves in early November, because Eddie Murphy had some classic comedies on Netflix that were leaving Netflix early November, and there were some movies I'd never seen, so we decided to watch them before we lost the opportunity, at least in the short term. And those were Beverly Hills Cop and Coming to America. Both are iconic films that I have heard about my whole life and I've seen imagery from, and I know a little bit about some of the plot and the characters and stuff, but I never actually sat down and watched them. Just like I had never seen any of the Lethal Weapon movies, for instance, until the 2010s. For some reason, they just passed me by. I actually did a couple episodes on this podcast earlier on, catching up with some things that were embarrassingly overlooked in my film consumption career, including episode 9, where I talk about watching like the Mad Max movies that I'd never seen until later in life, and episode 19, I talk about some classic horror movies that I only saw more recently. But I've always been an Eddie Murphy fan. I was introduced to him in the 90s, of course, because that's when he started making more family-friendly stuff. It makes sense that my parents wouldn't let me watch his R-rated stuff from the 80s. So, of course, I saw like, what was it, like Nutty Professor and The Clumps. At the point where he started playing a bunch of different characters in the same film, none of those had a lasting impact on me. They were just silly for silly's sake. And they were a showcase of Eddie Murphy playing a bunch of different bit parts because he could. But I didn't realize that had started a lot earlier. I don't know if Coming to America was his first foray into that style of comedy, but I also wasn't surprised to see him playing so many different characters with different comedic styles. But in general, I enjoyed the movies, especially for how charming and how 80s they both were, both for their sincerity and self-aware silliness. And one thing I really miss from that era, even though I didn't watch most of this stuff when it was first coming out because I was too young, but as I started watching movies from the 80s when I was growing up in the 90s, how loose the direction was, how much they let the actors act in scenes and play off each other, and how there wasn't so much coverage and so many takes to get every shot and every line just right. Sometimes that style does really affect pacing and the overall flow to the story and everything, but it also has a sense of realism, even in comedy movies like this, just in terms of the feel and the grit. So they were very, comforting in that way to watch, even when there wasn't a ton going on, when Eddie Murphy was just like messing with the cops that were tailing him. It was really charming. But otherwise, my biggest takeaway from both of these movies, just from being more familiar with Eddie Murphy's later super over-the-top, really cartoony kind of fare from the 90s and then leading into his voice acting with Donkey and stuff, I was surprised how straight he played both characters in both of these movies. I thought they were going to be way more wacky and silly and unrealistic, but they actually felt like kind of just regular guys. Even the prince of whatever the fake country that was, Wakanda, I was surprised how kind of calm and straightforward he played them. He was goofy and silly when the scene called for it, but his character wasn't like amped up and just way out in left field. But that especially helped like in Coming to America when wacky stuff would happen, or there were other wacky characters around him. It gave him a little bit more to play off of and to react to than if he was just part of all that zaniness. And then with Beverly Hills Cop, in particular, I was really surprised because I guess I just assumed like Lethal Weapon and a lot of the other cop and buddy cop 80s action movies that get lumped together. I just thought this was going to be a much more action-oriented movie, but there was really only one action sequence in the beginning and then that very end set piece at the mansion, which I'm sure that's not the first time that's happened, but that was so reminiscent of so many action movies like Bad Boys 2, where you have like a rich guy and his thugs in his mansion and they're infiltrating it. Geez, even Iron Man 3 ripped off of that. But the rest of the movie was more of like a detective kind of dramedy, and it was a lot slower in that regard than I thought it would be. Not boring. I just was expecting a lot more shootouts and car chases and stuff, but no, this was actually a lot more of a story than it was a bunch of set pieces, and I was surprised by that. So I am interested to see the rest of the Beverly Hills Cop franchise, though I've heard that the third one is not very good when I've looked at some retrospectives and things, but because both of these movies surprised me a little bit just in their tone and their execution, I'd be curious to see how their sequels turned out, though Beverly Hills Cop 4 and Coming to America 2 that were both released in the past couple years, legacy sequels have just not interested me, so I'm not going to make any big rush to see them, but I may make it a point if I have nothing else to watch. The next thing that my wife and I saw in the theaters was Wake Up Dead Man. I am absolutely a Last Jedi hater, and I'm no particular fan of Rian Johnson, though I did see Brick back when I was in film school at one of our indie theaters in Philly, and I only really saw it because it had Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and then it had Claire from Lost. So I went more just because I liked the actors in it, and I didn't know who Rian Johnson was. That might have been his first movie. I'm not even sure. And I remember kind of liking it. It was a modern noir detective mystery, but I haven't seen it since, and I haven't even thought about it. And then I didn't see Looper, though maybe I should have. I heard it was pretty good. Just never got around to it. When I heard he was going to do a Star Wars movie, I was like, okay, interesting choice. I didn't know what to make of it. And then we all saw what happened. But I was curious, especially because of how disillusioned I was by The Last Jedi and the Star Wars downfall that he didn't start, but definitely played a big hand in, just to see where he would go after that. So that's why, like a lot of people, I think I watched Knives Out with more of a morbid curiosity, and I thought it was enjoyable and fun. I haven't been inspired to watch it again since, but I don't know if that's as much of a Rian Johnson thing or just how I generally react to murder mysteries, because once you know everything, no matter how well it's constructed, I don't really feel like there's much to get from it from future viewings, because most of the time in mysteries, like I've said a million times on here, I think the more interesting part of murder mysteries is usually already happened, and then I'm just not really into the detective part of stuff. I know that people love piecing things together and the puzzles and everything, but maybe that's why I'm not really big into puzzles in general. Like, I don't like getting a 1,000-piece puzzle on a table and having to go through every one. It just bores the living heck out of me, and I want to do something more engaging and productive with my time. So I find with a lot of murder mysteries that a movie about what led up to the murder would be a lot more interesting than what happens afterwards, and then just figuring it out and then people getting their comeuppance or not or whatever. But still, I thought it had enough humor, it had a fun tone, it had some subversions. But the other thing about mysteries that I often find to be true, sometimes this isn't the case, but more often it is than not, is characters usually don't get a lot of development, because there's usually a large cast of characters because of all the red herrings and everything, because if there was a very small cast of characters, then it'd be easy to figure out who did it, which leaves little time for character development because of the cast and also how much plot are usually shoved into these things and how many diversions and subversions and twists and turns and la la la. But that's why when Glass Onion came out, I was expecting to kind of feel the same way. I was going to watch it because I did enjoy Knives Out for what it was. And I did like Glass Onion a little bit less. The characters especially were a lot more insufferable. Not that every character in every movie has to be super likable, but these like rich tech billionaire influencer and all those people riding those coattails and stuff were just so uninteresting to me. So cliche. And I know that was the point. I mean, Rian Johnson definitely borders on satire with these Knives Out movies, which, by the way, I know I'm not the first one to say this, but I cannot get over the fact that they call these Knives Out mysteries. I know that is not what Rian Johnson wanted, that he just called the first one Knives Out because that was part of the plot. But then, of course, Netflix and Hollywood has to brand everything as a franchise because, God forbid, they just make stuff and let it be what it is these days. But at this point, calling Wake Up Dead Man a Knives Out mystery is just asinine, and that really bothers me. And these companies, man, they're the worst. But here, take my money because I still want to watch your stuff. Anyway, I felt the same way about this one that I did about the other two, that I enjoyed it while I was watching it. It was an interesting mystery. It had really good performances, but like most people have said about this one too, I did like, especially compared to Glass Onion, the little bit darker tone, a little bit more introspection. I thought the main priest guy was actually the most compelling protagonist / suspect that Johnson has written so far. And I thought he really made the movie worth it and the mystery and everything. And I thought thematically, because of that, this one had the most to say, and that's what really kept me engaged. The more that I have thought about the mystery aspects and also, watched other people's reactions and reviews and analyses of it and everything, and how Rian Johnson writes mysteries in general and how he cheats a lot and how there's so many logic holes in things. I totally get all that, and I agree. And I know for some people that really like murder mysteries, that really breaks the whole experience. But like I said, for me, I'm in it for more general entertainment, and I am entertained by his movies. So I thought it was fine and just as good, maybe a little bit better than the other two on the writing and the character front. But my biggest takeaway from seeing that movie was my intention for seeing it in the theater, because I had heard that Glass Onion had a short theatrical run, and Netflix does that with some of their movies. With us being on the horizon right now of the very real possibility of Netflix acquiring Warner Brothers, I really wanted to, in my own small way, give Netflix the middle finger by seeing one of their movies in the theater that I know that they release reluctantly just so it can be considered for awards and stuff. And I was happy to see on the weekend that it premiered in the theaters that it had a really good turnout, at least in my theater here in downtown Richmond, Virginia. But even more than that, it was my first time in a theater that had reclining seats, even though we bought tickets late, so it was mostly sold out, and there were only seats in the front row. And we all know that the front row, unless you have like double jointedness and you can turn your head like an owl to see the whole screen all at once, you're in for some real neck pain after sitting in the front row. But this was alleviated a little bit by the fact that these were in recliner chairs, and I've never been in a theater that has had those before. And that was absolutely amazing. It was so comfortable. It felt like being in my living room, but in a theater. Sooner than I expected, I was not dragged, but cajoled to see another modern anime in the theaters with my son. This time it was Jujutsu Kaisen, and just like with Chainsaw Man, I tried to watch a couple episodes because I hadn't seen this yet, even though he kept asking me when I'm going to watch it, and I was like, someday when I get to it. And unlike Chainsaw Man, I found this show to be a lot denser and a lot more inaccessible just in terms of the lore. And I don't know, wasn't as engaged with it as I was with Chainsaw Man. This one was a lot more akin to Demon Slayer for me. So I had a feeling going into the actual movie that it was not really going to be a totally fulfilling experience, and I wasn't wrong. I try to go to every movie and every show that I watch with an open mind and to want to like it and enjoy it, but I do have certain expectations, and in this case, it's not really fair to have those level of expectations for something that I don't have the context for. So for like My Hero Academia, that I saw last year, I just decided to just let it be what it was and not make any judgments on it because I had no context for it. This one I had very minimal context, but at least a little bit. I knew who the main character was and what the main kind of plot thrust was. And then more so than Chainsaw Man, because Chainsaw Man was an actual movie that was constructed to be its own standalone thing. This was in that format that I've heard about but haven't actually seen in the theaters yet until this, where they had a sort of clip show of the first, season or two? I don't know how many seasons there have been. And then the first couple episodes of the upcoming season. And oh my gosh, it was so convoluted, and there were so many characters, and there was so much lore, and there was so much going on, both plot-wise, character-wise, and visually, that I just couldn't engage with it. I didn't even realize, I never do this, but I nodded off. I was just really tired that day for some reason. And my son elbows me and is like, "What are you doing? This is like the most amazing thing ever." And I just could not stay with it. It just lost me almost immediately. But seeing this now and looking back on the other shonen anime that I've seen, especially because of either my brother or my son in the past several years, I've noticed a formula that just doesn't work for me, where if you take out the specifics, you basically have the same thing over and over again. You have some special person who is either innately has or imbued through the plot with some special power, so they're like the special. And because of that, there's some larger hidden world revealed that affects them or their family or something. And this world involves some kind of ongoing battle with some kind of evil. It's usually really over-the-top violent, sometimes to a disturbing degree. And then when it's to that degree, for me, it just becomes desensitizing. If it's in a self-contained movie, it's one thing, but when it's a series and you just have people's limbs getting lobbed off every episode, it's like, all right, like, it's coming, and it loses that impact that I think it's supposed to have. And then most often you have these really long, sometimes multi-episode battles that are mostly comprised of inner monologues where the characters are figuring out their strategy and figuring out their powers and describing what they're going to do before they do it. And I'm sorry, but for me, seen multiple of these things now, it's just so repetitive and predictable, and when you have those things, you have boredom. I know that novelty and deep character stuff and concise intricate plotting is why a lot of people like this stuff. I know it's not why my son likes it. I know a lot of people like it because of that formula, because it's giving them something that they know what they're going to get, and they're going to really enjoy the visuals and the variations on that formula. Like in some, you have demons, but in Chainsaw Man, you have devils, but in Jujutsu Kaisen, they're called curses, or in Dawn, you have aliens, or there's ghosts, or whatever it is, but it's all kind of the same idea. And having those variations on this formula does allow for some really interesting creative visuals. I think that's my favorite part and my biggest positive takeaway from seeing this stuff, or at least being exposed to it to a certain degree, is how the character designers and the animators put different spins on aliens and ghosts and what a curse looks like, manifested in our world, and the difference between devils and demons and how they look when they level up and power up and stuff. There's really interesting stuff going on there, and there's a lot of creativity, even if it's not in the characters or the plot or the story. The visuals are really, really creative. But the problem for me is that visuals alone aren't enough to carry a movie for me, because visuals aren't story. Visuals are a vessel that you tell the story through, but the story is really down to the emotions and the themes, choices that characters make, and that stuff comes across all pretty rote and predictable with this shonen kind of storytelling. So, as I've known for a while, since watching Demon Slayer, but has only been reinforced to me, it seems that shonen anime is just not my genre, but it also seems that I'm going to continue to be pulled into this stuff because of my son, and he doesn't drive yet, and he doesn't have his own income, so I'm going to have to be his vessel to experience these things, especially when there comes to theaters, and I'm going to keep going in with an open mind and keep trying to find positives and everything that I can to make it a constructive experience for me, but I am starting to get a little jaded on this genre, and I don't know, we'll just see how things go from here. So throughout the fall, the big show that my wife and I were binging, was Orphan Black. She's brought it up several times since we've known each other, and it was finally on Netflix, so we were able to get through all 5 seasons, and we just finished it up in the past month or so. And when it comes to talking about shows and things, I used to, and maybe sometimes we'll do full podcast episodes because there's just so much to talk about, but I don't have time for making those kinds of episodes right now, so I'm going to try to keep this as brief as I can. But just starting with the general reactions and takeaways, I found it to be really enjoyable, super tense, great sci-fi. There were so many things about the way it was constructed, how it just kept moving forward. It was very thrilling and on the edge of your seat most of the time. But what I thought was really brilliant about it was how they were able to utilize and build in so much humor, sometimes even like slapstick comedy. Sometimes it almost bordered on farce, especially with the suburban family, Allison and Donnie, and that whole thing going on. Things would get so silly, and then in the same episode, you'd have some horrible, disgusting body horror, like the sister Rachel ripping her own eyeball out of her head and stuff like that, that it would sound on paper like really disparate and conflicting tones, but it was actually somehow they managed to hold it all together and make it mesh really, really well. And I think that's because with each different tonal area that they would explore, they went all the way with it. They didn't pull punches. If they were doing a thriller episode, it would be constantly suspenseful. There'd be tons of twists. But if they were doing something more comedic, they would commit, and they wouldn't make it all safe and half. They went all in whatever direction that they were going. And the fact that it wasn't all happening to the same characters at the same time, I think helped too, because each batch of characters and variations of Tatiana Maslany's character, which I'm not going to spoil, actually, because if you haven't seen it, I do really recommend watching it. But because there's so many different versions of her, there are a lot of opportunities to do those tonal shifts depending on like which version and which storyline you're focusing on. So one could be lighter and more comedic, where another you would just expect to be a lot darker. But then that made it all the more fun when all these characters would collide and interact, and they'd bring those different tones with them, and somehow they still managed to find that balance. I just thought it was really, really good. We'll get into Tatiana Maslany in a second, but I just want to give a shout out to her adopted brother, Felix. That actor and that character, when he was first introduced, he was so over the top that I just thought that he was going to be this walking cliche and really predictable. But he turned out to be, like most characters in the show, a very well constructed and dimensional character who went through several arcs and was so much more interesting and dynamic than he could have been. He could have just been this one-note caricature, but instead we actually had good writers on this show that cared about their characters and cared about the quality of the show, you could tell. And Felix was just one of the many examples on there that was super compelling and well written, and the more you got to know him, the more layers you saw peeled back, the more that you sympathize and empathize with him, but also the more he could surprise you. But it didn't feel like random. It felt in character when he would do something that might seem out of character, but then it would be given context. And yeah, it was just really, really well written. As is common, though, with multi-season shows that have a lot of different elements, like Lost had a lot of different genres they were playing with, and it also had a pretty big cast. So over time, the plot got really convoluted, and the logistics and sometimes character motivations were a little hard to follow. But by the end, I was really, really impressed how they circled back to a lot of loose ends and a lot of setups from previous seasons, especially even all the way back to season 1, where you had the original character that kind of was a catalyst for this whole plot to start, the cop Tatiana Maslany character, Beth. And we got to know more about her. I just figured that after a few seasons where they didn't really even bring her up, I was like, all right, that was just sort of a throwaway thing, or just like a catalyst, like I said. But no, they actually really fleshed her out and made her into an interesting character in hindsight, even though she wasn't an active part of the show. Turned out that she was a huge part of the plot, and they really gave her the respect that a character like that deserved, to not just be a plot device, but also be a person. Thematically, I was constantly triggered by this show because I have a long-standing abhorrence for the idea of transhumanism, for the idea that not only are humans the dominant species on this planet, but the rest of the planet is here for us to exploit, and it was given to us to exploit. And not only that, but all of our abilities to progress and innovate was like divine purpose, that we were given the ability to create these crazy, unhuman technologies that go way beyond anything a human would be capable of doing. And not only that, but that was given to us on purpose because that's part of our evolutionary track, that we will merge with these technologies, that because we created them, they are part of our fate. And someday, we'll reach peak evolution by becoming whatever we're divinely destined to be, which is some sort of hybrid human technological thing. And that idea just bothers me on so many levels that I don't have the time to get into right now. But I haven't seen a lot of media that gets into that. There was a great Dan Brown book about it called Inferno, which had a lackluster movie, but none of those Dan Brown movies were really given the care that they could have had to be memorable pieces of art. They were really just, like his books, a little bit more disposable, momentary entertainment. But thematically, I was really enraptured by this idea of transhumanism, which isn't a new idea, but the extent to which some people apparently believe that the path that we're on is not only going to, but is supposed to lead to some kind of next stage evolution with technology and the destruction of our natural environment makes me want to vomit. And this show leaned heavily into that, and it was kind of the basis for the whole thing. And it was really, really hard to separate the entertainment from my own feelings and thoughts about what they were exploring sometimes. And my wife would have to kind of like soothe me back to a place of, hey, we're just watching a show here. This isn't a TED Talk. I'd be like, yeah, I know, you're right. I need to relax. But I think that's also a testament to how well it was written, that it had such a visceral response from me, because what they were exploring was something that I do feel very passionately about on a thematic and practical front. But on a different kind of practical front, let's get into the biggest takeaway from this, for me at least, is Tatiana Maslany. Before I talk about her as an actress, I just want to talk about the logistics and the special effects real quick. We've all seen lots of really clever workarounds to having the same actor play multiple people, like we were just talking about Eddie Murphy earlier, but all the different people that are just one person that play like twins, like Lindsay Lohan in The Parent Trap or Nick Cage in Adaptation, things like that. We've seen this stuff for a long time. But in this case, we had one actress playing at least half a dozen roles, and sometimes more, and sometimes in the same shot. And that blew my mind. I mean, I know computer trickery can do anything now, but it's not just that they were able to pull it off in terms of having them all in the same shots a lot of the times when they were in the same spaces together, but how seamless it was, how they would interact and touch each other and hand things to each other and speak to each other when you could see both of their faces. It's one thing when they do like a composite and they just film that same space twice and they show you both shots at the same time, or they green screen it or whatever. But usually you can kind of see the seams. But in this case, for the most part, it was really, really, really hard to notice and pinpoint where the trickery and the movie magic was done. But also, and this is really the biggest takeaway that I have from this show, I think the biggest reason that all worked and was so convincing was Tatiana Maslany's performance. She was an absolute revelation for me. Like a lot of people, especially people that haven't seen Orphan Black before, my first exposure to her, and I didn't even watch it, I just saw a lot of the commentary about it and clips and things, was She-Hulk. And because of the controversy around that, I just had no desire to see her in anything after that. The whole She-Hulk thing was such a debacle that everybody involved, including Mark Ruffalo, were just collateral damage, and I just wanted to have nothing to do with it. So when my wife suggested we watch this show, I forgot that Tatiana Maslany was in it at first. And then we started watching it, my first reaction was like, oh no, it's her. But then almost immediately, that all went away, because she was such a good actress, so convincing as the different characters she was playing, that I was totally immersed and absorbed in her performance. And then as the show went on, not only did she play multiple characters, oftentimes in the same episode, sometimes, like I said, in the same scene, interacting with herself, I forgot half the time, or I had to remind myself that I was watching one person play all these different characters. And she played everybody from a petulant British lady to a pretentious, high-minded, above-it-all, aloof corporate lady to a Ukrainian girl that had been traumatized and brought up very religiously, to a trans man in like one episode, and I was kind of sad that we never saw that person again because they were really funny, to a whole bunch of other characters. Sometimes they would just pop up here and there, and I had to keep reminding myself over and over again, like, this is the same actress playing all these characters. She was so convincing. I constantly was like asking myself and asking my wife, I wonder what her pre-filming routine was. Like, would she do monologues or have a thing to get into character? Because it wasn't just the line delivery. It was her facial expressions, her body language. Every character was very distinct. You knew as soon as you saw this same face on the screen, you knew which character she was playing. Even, and this was the most mind-blowing part to me, it wasn't just the special effects and her playing off herself in the same shots and stuff, but when she would be playing a character that was playing a character diegetically or inside the story, when she'd be playing a different version of herself, when she'd have to go undercover, so one of her characters would have to pretend to be another version of the character, trying to convince somebody else in the show that they are that one person when we know it's the other person. And you could tell that it was her playing the other character. I can't articulate that very well, but there were so many different levels to the kind of acting and performances that were required from her to make that all work. And she pulled it off every episode immaculately. I was absolutely amazed. I'm still not going to watch She-Hulk because of what it is and what it represents, but I will watch Tatiana Maslany in anything else moving forward, because she was just absolutely incredible. And I think I did, actually. Wasn't she in The Monkey or something? Kind of a not really remarkable part, but that is to say that I have seen her in something else recently, and she was good. I just don't know if she's ever going to get the opportunity to do something this acting heavy again, because this is like got to be the mecca. I can imagine that most actors would kill for a role like this, where they get to not only play multiple characters, but play multiple characters with multiple arcs and characters that interact with each other and that have to pretend to be different versions of themselves and convince other people that they're not one of them, but another one, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's so much that was required of her in this. It must have been an actor's dream. So good on her. I'm glad that She-Hulk was just a swerve in the road, and I hope that she gets out of the shadow of that with more higher profile things that she actually gets to show off her talent, hopefully in the near future. So next up was Christmas season, and as you can hear on episode 34 of my Moviecast, my wife and I went to a Christmas show from the actress Alicia Witt, somebody that I've seen in a few things, but I really didn't know too much about, and I didn't know she was a singer. And apparently she's mostly known for, other than a lot of TV that she's done, her Hallmark Christmas movies that she's done. So after we saw her perform live in concert, we were like, well, we should go watch a Christmas movie with her in it. And we watched one, I don't even remember what it was called at this point, Christmas on Honeysuckle Lane or something. And it was just the most predictable, safe Christmas schlock that I was expecting. So I don't really have anything profound to say about it, other than the fact that in terms of her acting, it wasn't that she was bad, but she made the weirdest faces. Her reactions to stuff was constant, like somebody was shoving dead fish under her nose or something. I don't know. She just had like these weird, I think she actually would do really well in horror movies. I should see if she's in any horror movies, because she just had like the strangest reactions to like the smallest, most menial little things. But another one we watched, because I had seen the Honest interview from Screen Junkies, who does the Honest trailers for the Amazon Prime movie Merv with Charlie Cox and Zooey Deschanel, and they were just so cute and charming together, and I just love Charlie Cox so much. And I've barely seen him in anything other than as Daredevil, except for Stardust. So other than just wanting to watch some light Christmas fluff, I was curious to see him in something non-Matt Murdock-y. And the movie itself wasn't anything super special. It was pretty standard, just in terms of the plot and the characters and the situation and everything. But what I actually found interesting about it, though, was that it was marketed, because, we watched the trailer first and I saw that Honest interview on YouTube. I thought it was going to be a through and through dog movie, where like it was going to be all these dog shenanigans and the dog was constantly going to be the focus and the catalyst and, the thing that like turns every scene, where the characters are like fighting or they're about to kiss or something, that a dog jumps in and, oh no, the dog's making a mess, or the dog ran away or something like that. But the dog was actually hardly in the movie. The dog was definitely the catalyst for the main storyline, where they both go to Florida and have to interact because of this shared responsibility of the dog, even though they're broken up. But the dog became more and more of an afterthought, and there were a lot of scenes where the dog was like not even shown. So it really was more character focused, and I did appreciate it for that, because it did give the chance for the characters and the story to breathe a little bit. Again, it wasn't super deep or profound or anything, but it did subvert my expectations in that regard, that it wasn't a total silly romp. It was more of a comedy with a dramatic infusion. And even though, like most rom-coms, it kind of just rushed into its ending and everything was fine by the end, where there was a lot of stuff that was still unresolved between these people and their emotional hurt and everything, I found it to be a generally bit of a step above a lot of movies of its ilk, and it was surprisingly enjoyable. Also, way too long. It could have easily shaved off like 20 minutes, but what comedy isn't these days? The other thing, though, that stood out to me about it was Zooey Deschanel had like something wrong with her mouth. I don't know if she had some kind of like mishap with lip filler or nerve damage or something. I don't want to speculate, and I hate, when people try to make assertions and judgments about celebrities and things. But we've known and seen Zooey Deschanel in a lot of stuff for a long time. Now that she's getting a little bit older, I'm always curious to see what actresses do with that chapter of their career when they're not the young, more peppy, marketable version of themselves, but are more seasoned. And I even looked it up, and there's a lot of speculation out there, but no official word that something is awry. But I mean, she just had like a Sylvester Stallone thing going on, and I thought it was really conspicuous. And it just is weird, and I hope she's okay. But I mean, I guess just because I know the actress from so much other stuff, it was just distracting, unfortunately. So my brother was in town last weekend, and we were just looking for something light and quick to watch as we were winding down from a day of brotherly shenanigans. And as we were scrolling and Idiocracy flipped by, we found out that my wife had never seen it. So my brother and I were like, all right, let's show her Idiocracy and see how she feels about it. And I don't think I've seen this all the way through since it first came out-ish. I didn't even see it in theaters. I saw it after it was on home video or whatever. And that's just because I found it to be a pretty big disappointment. My brother and myself and other friends of ours that you've heard on this podcast are all huge Office Space fans, and we grew up on Beavis and Butthead, so we're big Mike Judge fans. And if I'm not mistaken, this was Mike Judge's next movie after Office Space, and we just had high hopes for it because Office Space was such a classic. And even though it's not perfect, it had so much great commentary. Even as teenagers, we could tell that the satire was very spot on because a lot of us had parents that worked in offices and things too. And then when I was in college and beyond, and I've worked in offices and I've had other professional experiences, that movie, even as dated as it is in some ways, it's so timeless and so biting towards corporate culture. You know, sometimes if I'm going to a meeting and somebody is like, hey, where are you headed? I'm like, got a meeting with the Bobs to call me at home. Or if I'm fighting with a printer and I'm just like, PC load letter, and then I have a daydream about taking it out to a field with a baseball bat and, you know, the rest. So we just had high hopes when Idiocracy came out because it was also dealing with social commentary and it was very timely. And I just thought it was a huge dud. I love the opening scene, which I know has been debunked since in terms of like the scientific efficacy of dumb people outbreeding smart people and all that. There's videos about that on YouTube and stuff, but still, I think it's super clever and really well constructed and really funny. But the rest of the movie just kind of plods along almost reluctantly. And I think a big part of that, and I have always said this about the Wilsons, I really don't think that Owen Wilson, but especially Luke Wilson, are very good actors, and they're just charisma vacuums, especially Luke Wilson. He is so bland. And I know that that was the point of his character in this one, that he was supposed to be the most average person ever. But there's something about him. I think you could have a cardboard cutout do his lines, and it would be more engaging than him. I don't know what it is. At least Owen Wilson has a little bit of charm and charisma, at least comparatively. But I just think that Luke Wilson was really the wrong casting choice for that character. And Maya Rudolph, I didn't watch SNL at that point. I was long since not a modern SNL fan. I loved it in the 90s, but I just fell off with it after the Will Ferrell, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler days because I didn't find any of them funny at the time. I've come around on them since with their TV work and films and things, but none of them to me could compare to the 90s comedy gods and all the ones that came before. So I didn't really know anything about Maya Rudolph as a comedian, but I thought likewise in the movie she was just so lackluster and just kind of phoning it in. There just wasn't much to her. So I never revisited it, and now watching it this time, we thought maybe, you know, we'd at least get a good laugh out of it. And I did. There were moments that were funny, just ow my balls and stuff. Things that I already knew were going to be funny. This one goes in your ear and your mouth and your butt. Oh, wait, no, hold on. Stuff like that. There are definitely iconic lines from it that I still will say to this day, like electrolytes, it's what plants crave. So there were moments in it that were funny and continue to be, but still as a work, as a cohesive piece, I just feel like it just really falls flat. And one of the other big reasons for that, aside from the casting, I think is the lack of stakes. There's no urgency to anything. Yeah, Luke Wilson and Maya Rudolph are generally uncomfortable. Well, really just Luke Wilson. Maya Rudolph seems like she's doing just fine when he tells her that they have to go back in time. But he wasn't happy in the past either, or fulfilled. He was just kind of going along. So there's nothing like, you know, a child or a relationship or even like a winning lottery ticket or something that he has some kind of compulsion to get back to. And there's nothing in the present day future setting that is really compelling him to have to go back. There's no big danger. He's just kind of generally like, I just kind of want to get out of here, whatever. And then the way the movie wraps up, there's nothing lost when they find out that the time machine was just a ride. yeah, that's a clever gag, but plot-wise and character-wise, it doesn't really matter because nothing really mattered in this whole situation. It's all just like window dressing. But I think the other big part of that I've already kind of touched on is the characters themselves are completely one-dimensional. They just don't have any layers. They don't have any real tangible motivation. The whole thing about him being the most average guy in the 2000s, but then being the smartest man in the world in the future is a funny idea. But he still could have been an average person, but still had some kind of characterization. But aside from that, he's not given any real growth and dimensions. He has no arc. Just because he ends up solving a lot of the issues in the future and becomes president and everything, it doesn't pay off anything that was set up about him. His relationship with Maya Rudolph is not a payoff to anything. Everything is just very surface and empty and devoid of any real purpose other than just momentary chuckles. But all that said, there was a big positive takeaway this time around for me. I didn't recognize it as much the first time that I watched it, probably because I was bored and just disengaged. But this time, I was really enraptured by the set design and how much it reminded me of the Super Mario Brothers movie. No, not the recent Illumination one, the one with Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo from the early 90s, which I love. And I do have a podcast about why I love that movie so much coming up sometime this year, whenever I can get to it. But it was so gritty and cheap, but in a seemingly intentional way. The way that their cars were retrofitted golf carts, just like the way that those armored cars in Mario Brothers were Mustangs or something, that they put this Mad Max kind of armor on. The matte paintings of the cities of garbage, very Wall-E-esque, all that practical stuff I found to be very charming, and that is where the movie shined, was in its production design and set design, and it's giving me something to appreciate about it, so it's not so ho-hum when I think about that movie. So I am glad I watched it again, just so I can have something positive to take away from it other than a couple funny lines. Another show that my wife watched in the past few weeks that we got through pretty quickly because it was actually a short form comedy, which you don't see that much anymore. Even Arrested Development started doing 45-minute episodes or 50-minute episodes or whatever, which was stupid. But we watched the Ted Danson show, Man on the Inside, because you might have heard that we watched Good Place earlier this year. And I haven't seen Ted Danson in anything, I don't think, since Cheers. And I didn't really watch Cheers, but my parents did, so I watched it a little bit with them growing up. But he was great in Good Place, of course. And we heard good things about Man on the Inside from some friends, so we decided to watch it. The second season had just dropped when we started watching the first season. And as usual, at least based on The Good Place, Ted Danson was super charming and likable, and you just want to give him a big hug. He's so funny. His timing is impeccable, but how he sells everything when he plays really straight, he's so good. And he was lucky to have, just like in The Good Place, a great cast around him that also had really good comedic timing, that played off him really, really well, like his PI boss, who is no nonsense, but he has a way of both getting under her skin and triggering her to get annoyed with him, but also having a lot of truth and mentorship that breaks through her walls. A lot of the situations and the red herrings and stuff, I mean, it's another investigative show, so it's not my favorite genre on the surface, and we'll get more to that in a second, but I did find the comedy to be pretty consistently top-notch through the whole thing, even when it was a little bit more physical and not as, highbrow. It was always making me laugh, and that's what a comedy should do. But like with most modern comedies, this was more of a dramedy, which at first I often find a little annoying, but if the characters are good enough and the story is well written enough, I'll go with it, and I'll take a dramedy for being a dramedy, especially if it can balance out the drama with the laughs, like Scrubs or something that does that so well. And I thought that this did it great, and what I really liked about the way that they structured this show was that the mystery and the investigation and the crimes and everything was only kind of half of what the plot of the show really was. This was a very character-focused and character-driven show. And you just don't see that much anymore, especially with high-concept show like this. An elderly gentleman, recluse, needs to do something to break out of his shell, so he becomes a non-qualified private investigator in a retirement home and then in a college in the second season. But there would be whole episodes that would go by that they didn't focus on that plot at all. And some might say, I haven't really heard any chatter about this show yet. It hasn't bubbled up, but I can definitely go look for it if I wanted to. But I'm going to assume that rubs some people the wrong way, because I've heard people talk about that in other contexts where there's filler, and this could totally be construed that way. I would totally understand if somebody felt like there was a lot of filler in this show, even though it was, maybe like 8 episodes or something, and they were only half an hour long, so it's not a long show. It's not like it's 23 episodes over a whole season and half of it was filler or something. I wouldn't call any of the episodes that it had that weren't mystery investigative focused filler at all, because they were always developing and moving forward with the characters, their own internal stuff, but especially the relationships. These characters are all so affected by each other that where the show starts and where it ends up in season 2 is a completely different dynamic for everybody involved, to the point that the characters are making completely different life decisions than they would have made had they not met and interacted and had the experiences that they've had together. And that is just a sign of really good intentional writing. The people that were making this show obviously had a good idea, not just of how to make 10 dance and get some good laughs out of the audience, but how to keep this show moving forward. It actually reminds me a lot of what I mentioned earlier about Murders in the Building, where I do feel like Murders in the Building, though it does have good character stuff in it, it's not as character focused. It is much more plot focused. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of filler in that show either, but there is a lot of time where I feel like it's spinning its wheels and it's sort of hedging its bets until it gets to the climax where all the big stuff can actually happen. But in Man on the Inside, it seems to be a lot less about that, the payoff to the investigation, and it's way more about the journey along the way. And I really, really enjoyed it for that. Also, plot-wise, there's no major villains. There kind of was in the second season, but not really. But especially the first season, there was really no bad guys. There was nobody that was mustache twirling and behind it all or anything. It seems like the writers of the show really understand how to give grace to both the characters and the audience, that we can connect and stay with these people on a journey without them having to come to some kind of huge blowout, essentially, whether it's emotionally or physically or plot-wise. It all just felt a lot more natural. I mean, it is heightened in some ways, but it had a very, very relatable flow to it. Things progressed in a way that felt right for this world, for these characters, and for the plot. And one thing that I think actually helped with that, which is usually, I was just railing against this with Idiocracy, but the stakes in this show are very low. But I think that's intentionally so. This isn't meant to be high drama. It's meant to be more small, subtle, calmer, human drama or dramatic tension, as opposed to, oh my God, if they don't accomplish their mission, it's going to ruin everything, or it's going to end the world, whatever. Usually without higher stakes, stories can feel meandering and unimportant and stagnant. But in this one, the fact that there was no big evil, there were no bad guys, really, except for our sort of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg stand-in in season 2. But even then, he really wasn't a super big antagonist. He was more of a plot device, really. The show just felt very comforting that we were watching these people go on this journey and grow together, but there didn't need to be any big tension around all that forces things to happen or leaves big cliffhangers. Again, it just felt more kind of natural, even in a fictional, sometimes a little bit, unrealistic kind of world that they built here. So I'm really looking forward to season 3 and hopefully
Beyond!
And that is it for 2025. This was an experiment. If you listen to part 1 of my 2025 roundup, you heard me explain how I went from doing YouTube shorts to this podcast for this kind of commentary about movies and TV. I know that these episodes are really long, and they're definitely way longer than I expected them or had intended them to be. So I'm going to keep kind of experimenting around with this. I really do want to keep this a little bit more streamlined. So 2026 is upon us, and I'm looking forward to what it has in store in terms of content, but also the opportunity to continue to find ways to put my thoughts and feelings about movies and TV out there and interacting with people that have thoughts and feelings too. So if you have any responses or ideas, or anything else you want to yell at me about, find me at breathingunderwater.us. And I'm Dan, and Happy New Year.